wide. A high desert basin at 2 in the morning, 500 acres walled off in 10 feet of steel floodlights blazing white against the dark. Move in. A gray farmhouse at the field's edge, its windows lit a purple crop glowing crimson from within the rows. Closer. A woman on the porch, canvas coat, bandaged hands, a mug of black coffee going cold as she watches the road. She is not afraid. That is the first thing wrong. Pull back. Headlights. A convoy comes off the ridge without sirens. Engines killed men on foot through the frozen sage. Tighter. Boots. Mattocks. A thermal charge pressed to a fence post by a hand that has done this on 4 continents. She does not reach for the shotgun. She sets down the mug. Somewhere beneath the field, something begins to hum low and steady climbing, and 30 feet of steel wire melts into the dirt. By the time the first hard frost silvered the Cinnabar Basin that November, the men of Redfern had learned to move at night. They came on foot down the county road with their headlamps taped over to a slit, carrying empty coffee cans and pillowcases, and in one case a child's plastic sand bucket that a father had emptied of its beach toys on the drive out. They were not thieves by trade, not a one of them. One was a deacon who had passed the collection plate down the same pews for 20 years. 2 ran the grain elevator and had never so much as shorted a farmer on a weight ticket. A retired highway surveyor with a hip that had been replaced twice crawled the last 50 yards on his belly through the frozen sage. And when the deputies caught him at the gray edge of dawn, with both fists packed full of black dirt, he wept openly. Not out of shame at being taken, but because he had not gotten enough. Because the deputy's boot came down on his wrist before he could fill the second can. That was the season the single handful of soil off the old Bristow tract was worth more than a man's good name in that country, worth more than his standing in the church and his credit at the bank, and the respect of the sons who watched him hauled off in the back of a cruiser. The whole basin knew the arithmetic of it, by then knew that the dirt was worth stealing and worth risking prison to steal, and yet not one of them, pressed on it, could have told you how such a thing had come to pass, on ground that 8 months before they would not have crossed the street to spit on. To understand how the richest earth in the West came to lie behind a melted fence in a county where nothing had ever been worth stealing, you have to go back to the tail end of the previous winter, to the flat black hours when she first came. She came in the dark, which was the first thing anyone in the basin ever remembered about her, and the thing they came back to when they told the story afterward, because the Cinnabar Basin was a place where arrivals were meant to be witnessed. A stranger did not simply appear in that country. A person moved into a place, and the diner knew of it by the following breakfast, and the feed cooperative knew of it by noon, and the church knew the shape of the family by Sunday, the number of children, and the denomination they'd carried in from wherever they'd left. That was the order of things, the slow public accounting by which a valley took the measure of a newcomer and decided how much of itself to lend them. This woman broke the order before she ever spoke a word. She arrived the way weather arrives, without announcement and without apology, in the flat black hours between the passing of the last freight train and the first hoarse call of a rooster, when there was no soul awake on the county road to mark her coming and carry the news back to town. 3 shipping containers rode in on a lowboy trailer behind a tractor rig that carried no company name on its doors, no logo, no permit numbers. A curious man could have written down. The driver dropped the containers at the edge of the Bristow parcel in a wide gravel apron, unhooked them one by one with the mechanical patience of a man paid well to ask nothing, turned the empty rig around in the road and drove off toward the interstate without ever once fully cutting his engine, as though even the truck did not wish to be caught lingering on that ground. The containers sat there in the starlight padlocked, hulking, ticking faintly as their steel skins gave up the day's stored heat to the cold. And beside them stood a woman in a heavy canvas work coat with a 12-gauge shotgun broken open over the crook of her elbow. She watched the red taillights of the departing rig shrink and shrink toward the black rim of the world, and she did not move to unlock anything, did not go inside, did not do any of the 100 small, restless things a person does upon arriving somewhere new. She simply stood and watched the road empty itself of the last witness to her coming, as though she had all the time in the world and none of it to waste on strangers. Her name, the county recorder would later confirm for anyone who came asking, and a good many people came asking before it was over, was Della Hargrove. She had bought the deed to 500 acres of the most thoroughly ruined ground in 3 states for the price of a used pickup truck at a tax auction held on a folding table in the courthouse basement where hers had been the only hand raised in the room. The clerk who ran the auction, a decent man near retirement, who had watched that parcel come up unwanted year after year, had asked her twice whether she understood precisely what she was buying, had all but begged her across the folding table to reconsider before she signed. She had understood it, the clerk told the diner afterward, better than he ever would in his life. She had signed without reading past the legal description because she had come there knowing exactly which 500 poison acres she wanted and precisely why she wanted them. And no warning from a kindly clerk was going to move a woman who had already crossed half a continent to sit at that particular folding table. The Bristow tract was the basin's open wound, and every soul in Redfern carried a private theory about it the way a man carries a scar he can't stop touching. Half a century back, before most of the living could remember the silver works up on the ridge, had run its tailings down the draw with every spring melt year after year, until the runoff had crept into the flat below and settled there and stayed curdling the earth into something pale and cracked and faintly unmistakably wrong. Alkali bloomed across the surface of it in a white crust like a frost that never melted no matter how the sun beat down. Nothing green had taken root there in 50 years, but the toughest and most bitter of the desert weeds, and even those grew stunted and sparse, as though the ground begrudged them. 3 men in living memory had looked at the low price of the parcel and the promise of the water rights stapled to it, and let themselves believe they were smarter or more stubborn than the dirt. And all 3 of those men had gone under broken on that ground the way a wagon breaks on a bad grade. The last of them, a raw-boned and stubborn Norwegian named Sorensen, who had sunk his wife's inheritance and his own 2 hands into the fight, had walked into his own barn on the morning the bank came to take back the rest of what he owned, and had put a bullet through the floorboards and then through himself, and had been found by his hired man that same afternoon. After Sorensen, no one tried. The county let the parcel rot on its tax books, and the men at the diner spoke of it the way they spoke of the cemetery, out past the grain elevator, with a lowered voice and a quick change of subject. Because it was known in that country that the Bristow ground had killed a good man, and a place that has killed a man is owed a certain silence. Della Hargrove did not lower her voice when she spoke of the ground, because in those first weeks she did not speak at all, not to anyone. She did not walk into Ruth Ann Pruitt's diner to introduce herself over the pie case, though the entire front counter watched the county road through the plate glass for the better part of a week, expecting her to appear the way every newcomer eventually appeared, hungry for a hot meal and a friendly face. She did not open a line of credit at the feed cooperative, where old Delbert kept a leather-bound ledger of every family for 40 miles in every direction and took a private proprietary pride in his ability to read a man's whole soul off the size and timing of his seed order. She moved instead into the dead Sorensen farmhouse at the far corner of the parcel, a gray sun-blistered wreck of a place, with a porch that sagged in the middle like the spine of a swayback horse, and windows gone milky with 50 years of blown grit. And within 48 hours of taking legal possession, she had done the one single thing that told the whole basin everything and nothing at once, the thing they would all remember and none of them would understand until it was far too late to matter. She built a wall. The crew that built it came from out-of-state 6 men in matching gray work shirts who did not drink their evenings away at the Antler Saloon and did not take their breakfast at Ruth Ann's counter, who bought their diesel in the next county over so as to leave no account behind them, who slept in a 5th-wheel camper they had hauled onto the property and parked in the lee of the shipping containers. They did not talk to the locals who found reasons to drive slow past the gate, did not so much as nod. They set fence posts to a depth no cattle operation on earth would ever have needed, sinking them in concrete like the footings of a bridge. They strung 10 full feet of high-tensile steel mesh around the entire 500-acre boundary, taut top and bottom, and where the wire ran up to meet the corner posts, they welded steel plate over the joins so that not even a determined man with hand tools could peel it back. The whole of it went up in a single hard week of labor, and when the crew was done and gone, the Bristow tract no longer looked like a farm that had gone to ruin and been forgotten. It looked like something the government kept people out of some silent installation with a purpose no civilian was meant to know, and the Cinnabar Basin, which carried in its collective memory a long and bitter history of the federal government, fencing off land that ranchers had grazed for generations, did not care for the feeling of that wall one bit. A fence that keeps cattle in is a neighbor. A fence that keeps men out is a question, and the basin does not love a question it cannot answer. Emmett Rourke liked the wall least of any man in the valley, though he would sooner have swallowed his own tongue than admit the word dislike to a living soul, because to dislike a thing was to grant it power over you. And Emmett Rourke had spent a lifetime granting power to nothing. He did not first own outright. Rourke owned the basin the way a river owns the bed it has cut. 10,000 acres of him wrapped the Bristow parcel on 3 of its 4 sides, green and irrigated and heavy every summer, with alfalfa that ran 3 cuttings deep, and the water that made all that green possible in a high desert ran through headgates and ditches his own grandfather had secured back in the territorial days by means of a bribe paid to a circuit judge, a fact the family never spoke of and never once forgot. Rourke had been waiting on the Bristow tract for 11 patient years. He had been waiting for the county to finally give up the polite fiction that anyone would ever come along and pay the mounting back taxes waiting for the parcel to be declared abandoned so that he could fold its 500 worthless acres and, far more to the point, the senior water rights that came stapled to those acres like a deed to a fortune into his own sprawling empire for the cost of a filing fee and a handshake with a commissioner he had bought and paid for 2 elections running. A dead parcel had served Emmett Rourke's purposes far better than a living one ever could. A dead parcel made no claim on the shrinking aquifer. A dead parcel filed no papers and drilled no wells and asked no questions of the man whose cattle drank the basin dry. And now in the flat black hours of a winter night, some woman he had never met had walked in out of nowhere and clapped a padlock on 11 years of his patience. He passed his sentence on her at the diner one gray morning near the end of that winter, sitting at the counter with his good hat pushed back off his forehead and his boots crossed easy at the ankle, working steadily through a plate of eggs and fried potatoes, while Ruth Ann moved down the row of men refilling their cups. He pronounced his judgment on Della Hargrove the way he pronounced most things in that valley, as though the mere act of his pronouncing it settled the matter beyond any further discussion. Give her 3 months, his fork carving a lazy arc in the air toward the plate glass window, toward the far gray line of the new fence just visible across the flat. She'll pour every last dime she scraped together into fixing that poison, and she'll come out the far side of the summer with nothing to show for it, but blisters on her hands and a banknote she can't cover. Then I buy the water rights off the county for half of what that fool woman paid for the whole lot, fence and all. He chewed unhurried, a man at peace with the future. You could not raise a single thistle on that ground if you got down on both knees in the dirt and begged the Almighty God himself to send you one. That ground is done. It was done and finished before that woman was ever born, and no amount of gray shirts and steel wire is going to change what 50 years of silver poison put into the dirt. Ruth Ann Pruitt said nothing to that because Ruth Ann had stood behind that counter and watched 40 years of certain men be certain about certain things in her diner, and she had lived to bury a fair number of their certainties right alongside the men themselves. But she topped off his coffee without being asked the way she had 10,000 mornings running, and she let her own eyes travel out past his shoulder to the far gray line of the fence, and something in the sheer deliberate strangeness of that operation across the flat snagged at the edge of her attention like a loose thread caught on a nail and would not quite come free. Because Della Hargrove, whatever else the basin believed of her, was not down on her knees begging heaven for anything. In her entire first month on the Bristow tract, she did not plant so much as a single radish in the dirt. What she did instead, night after night, was receive. They came at night, the trucks, which was the second thing the whole basin would come to remember about that strange spring. Long-haul rigs with mud caked thick over their license plates, and nothing at all painted on their doors, grinding down off the interstate in the deepest and darkest hours, turning in one after another at the Bristow gate beneath a sky that seemed always on the nights they came to hold no moon. They did not carry the ordinary freight of working farm swallows in the spring. No man watching from the shoulder of the county road ever saw a tractor come rolling down off those trailers, nor a seed drill, nor the fat pressurized tanks of anhydrous ammonia, nor the towering pallets of white commercial nitrogen that stacked up every April behind Delbert's cooperative, like sandbags heaped against a coming flood. What came off those unmarked trailers instead made no earthly sense to anyone who watched it, and a great many people found reasons to be watching. Pallets of a fine gray powder dry as flour that the gray-shirted crew handled only while wearing respirators strapped tight over their faces. Steel drums that reeked on the nights the wind carried right of something brackish and fermented, and faintly rotten a low-tide stink of decaying kelp with a sharp vinegar edge cutting under it. And tarps, hundreds upon hundreds of them, industrial black and heavy as roofing, felt folded into dense cubes the size of hay bales and stacked in long rows along the trench lines until the whole of the near field looked in the gray light of dawn like some vast and orderly shipping yard built to receive cargo from the bottom of the sea. Wyatt Poole was the one who first put clumsy words to what was happening behind the wall, because Wyatt Poole could not keep himself on the lawful side of a fence to save his own young life. He was 16 years old that spring, all sharp elbows and bottomless appetite, and he rode for Emmett Rourke on the summer wages that let him keep gas in the tank of an old pickup he loved with a purer devotion than he had ever managed to feel for another human being. He also carried a habit that his mother had prayed over on her knees, and his employer had beaten out of 2 other boys before him, which was that a locked gate to Wyatt Poole was not a warning at all, but a personal invitation, a dare left lying in the road for him to take up. He went over the Bristow fence 3 nights running that spring before the mesh got charged hot enough to teach him better manners. And what he carried back to the Rourke ranch house, he delivered breathless on the porch steps, with the wide-eyed conviction of a boy who has crept up close to the elephant and lived to describe its size. "She's out there at 2 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Rourke." His weight shifting foot to foot on the boards, his hat crushed and twisting in both hands. "She's got these big halogen floodlights set up on stands, the whole field lit up bright as a night ball game, and she's not plowing. I watched her 3 nights, and I never one time saw her put a plow to that dirt. She's digging trenches, deep ones, straight as a carpenter's rule, and she's lining every single one of them with that gray ash powder off the pallets. And then she runs a hose down the middle, and she sprays this black stuff into the dirt, thick and slow like sludge like tar." The boy's young face worked, straining after words for a thing he had no words to hold. "And the smell of it, Mr. Rourke. It smells like copper, like a whole fistful of pennies gone hot in the sun, but there's something sweet cooked in underneath like burnt sugar, like a pan of candy left too long on the stove. It gets down into the back of your throat, and once it's in there, it just stays." Emmett Rourke laughed at the boy. It was an easy laugh, unhurried and complete the laugh of a man with 10,000 acres and senior water rights, explaining the plain workings of the world to a boy who owned a borrowed truck and a bad habit, and it was a laugh that would cost Rourke in the fullness of the year more than any other sound he ever made in his life. Composting his verdict landing with all the settled weight of scripture read from a pulpit. It's some fool California notion, boy. She read it out of a magazine, and now she's out there in the dark, cooking dirt like a pot of soup and calling it modern farming. Let her cook. 3 months, I told you, and I meant 3 months. 3 months, and she's gone back to wherever she came from, broken, beaten, and you can go dig for arrowheads across the whole 500 acres of it once the county puts the deed back in my hand where it belongs." He sent the boy on home to his mother. He did not send a single man to look closer, did not so much as walk to the far corner of his own land to glass the operation with his own eyes. That was the shape of Emmett Rourke's entire life laid bare in that one decision, and it would prove to be the exact shape of his ruin. As well, he never once in his years believed a single thing that he had not first thought of for himself, and so a thing he had not thought of could walk right up to the edge of his empire and grow there, and he would laugh at it until the day it burned him. But there was nothing careless, nothing haphazard in a single spadeful of what was taking shape behind that wall, and a wiser and warier man than Rourke would have felt the cold radiance of pure calculation coming off the place like heat shimmering off a stove lid. Every trench ran dead straight to a plan drawn somewhere out of sight. The gray ash went down to a depth measured to the inch and no deeper. The black slurry metered out of the tank rig at a rate that Della Hargrove watched climbing on a pressure gauge with the still absorbed patience of a physician taking a pulse and counting the beats against a watch. She kept no daylight hours in the fields at all, none so that a man driving past at noon saw only the black tarps and the wire and the empty gray farmhouse, and might have believed the place abandoned again. She worked strictly in the dark, her face sealed behind a full respirator, the floodlights blazing white against the desert night, and near the very end of April, when the rest of the basin was drilling spring wheat into ground, still soft and dark from the snow melt, and lifting their eyes to the sky to pray the rains would hold through the germination she at long last began to plant. Even the planting she hid. Whatever it was, she pressed down into those ash-lined trenches. She pressed it in under the double cover of full night in full mask. Small, dark-knuckled things, gnarled and hard as walnuts, that she cradled two at a time in a gloved palm and set into the waiting earth with the slow, deliberate care of a woman laying coins upon the eyes of the dead. She did not scatter seed by the handful the way a farmer sows a field. She placed each single nodule by hand, one after another, down the endless rows, kneeling and rising and moving on. And when a full row had been set, she rolled the heavy black tarp out over the whole length of it and staked the edges down against the ground so hard and so close that not one corner of it lifted or flapped, not even in the vicious gales that came screaming down off the ridge through the whole month of May. The winds that tore the roofing felt clean off two barns in the valley below and rolled a stock tank a quarter-mile across open pasture. From the county road, the near field looked by the end of that planting like nothing so much as a vast graveyard paved over entirely in black plastic row upon silent row of staked black tarp stretching toward the ridge, and the men who slowed their trucks on the shoulder to stare at it felt, without ever quite being able to say why the feeling came, that they were looking at something they had not been meant to see. Something laid to rest that ought to stay resting. Word of the strange doings out on the Bristow tract traveled the way all news traveled in that closed country, passing from the diner counter to the elevator scale, to the church pews, and looping back around again, growing a little in each retelling. And eventually the word reached the ear of a man who made his entire living precisely on the traveling of such words. Barrett Vance ran what he called a brokerage out of an office in Boise, though the word brokerage flattered the thing considerably. What Barrett Vance actually did for his money was smell out where a dollar was going to grow before the dollar itself had any notion. He had been the first man in 4 counties to lock up the entire regional supply of organic quinoa on forward paperback when the coastal restaurants first went mad for the stuff, buying up the growers' whole crop, before those simple men had begun to understand their own leverage. And he had turned the same trick a second time with a drought-hardy chickpea that a seed company down in the Palouse could not fill its orders for fast enough. Vance drove a silver sedan that he kept polished to a showroom shine, even down the dustiest of section roads, and he carried a smile that he deployed the way a carpenter deploys a chisel as a precision tool for opening a thing up. And when the whisper finally reached him of a lunatic recluse woman growing something unnameable under acres of black tarp on the most poisoned ground in the state, every last mercenary instinct the man owned stood straight up at once and pointed north. He came to the Bristow tract in broad daylight, which marked him for a fool in that country before he had rolled his window down or opened his mouth. He drove the silver car down the rutted Bristow lane with one soft hand draped over the top of the wheel, rehearsing his easy charm against the moment, and he did not get within 40 feet of the sagging farmhouse porch. Della Hargrove was already standing at the gate when his dust cloud settled, waiting inside the chain link with the 12-gauge riding easy in the crook of her arm, not leveled at anything in particular, which was somehow far worse than if she had thrown it up to her shoulder and drawn a bead on his windshield. She did not swing the gate open for him. She did not raise her voice in greeting or in warning. She simply stood there and waited and let the waiting do the whole of the work. Vance rolled his window down and gave her the full measure of the smile. "Miss Hargrove, Barrett Vance. I represent a number of buyers who pay top dollar for experimental crops, exactly the kind of forward-thinking operation I can see you've got running out here." His hand came out flat and open through the window palm to the sky, all reassurance and reason. "Now, whatever it is you've got incubating under all that black tarp, I can put a signed contract in your hand before I drive back out this lane today. You've plainly got yourself some overhead out here, all this infrastructure. Let me carry a little of that weight for you. I'm not selling, her voice flat and dry as the alkali flats stretching away behind her, and I'm not buying. The words came out with no hospitality in them, anywhere stripped clean of the reflexive Western warmth that greased even the most hostile conversation between strangers in that part of the country, the warmth that let two men who despised each other still discuss the weather. The bare absence of it unsettled Vance more than a slammed door and a leveled gun would have done. He tried her once more because trying once more, working an angle past the first refusal, was the whole of Barrett Vance's art and his religion. You don't have to trust me, Miss Hargrove. I'm not asking you to trust me. Trust the market instead. Whatever's growing under there, I'll guarantee you a number on it sight unseen right now. And here she said to him the thing that Barrett Vance would go on repeating to himself for the rest of a long and diminishing life, the sentence that turned his idle curiosity from a passing appetite into a wasting sickness he never afterward shook. Her eyes came up and settled on his unreadable, as the surface of a pond frozen a foot thick. You don't know what I'm growing, Mr. Vance. If you did, you would not be sitting there offering me a contract. You'd be offering me a vault. A single beat of silence, the dry wind moving the twine-tied hair against her cheek. Now get off my land before I decide to have you arrested for trespass, just for the pleasure of watching you explain yourself to a judge. Vance backed the silver car the entire length of the rutted lane, rather than turn his back on that gate and that gun and that flat frozen stare, and by the time his tires found the county road again, his wounded pride was a live coal lodged behind his breastbone. A lesser man, a wiser man, would have driven the long road home to Boise and forgotten the whole strange encounter by the county line. Barrett Vance was not a lesser man in any of the ways that might have saved him. He drove straight to a payphone bolted to the wall of a shuttered gas station at the edge of the nearest town, because certain kinds of calls Barrett Vance had learned never to make from any line that carried his own name. And he hired the finest private investigator his wounded vanity could stretch to afford. And he told the man in plain words to open Della Hargrove up like a tin can and pour out onto the table every last thing he found sealed inside her. He had not the faintest notion, not the ghost of one, that in lifting that receiver, he had just laid his own hand flat upon the live rail of a thing that would run its killing current through the whole of the Cinnabar Basin before the year had turned over. He believed he was chasing a crop. He was in truth walking with his polished shoes and his easy smile straight into the outermost edge of a snare that a mind far colder and far more patient than his own had begun setting in place long before the first unmarked truck ever turned in at that gate. The thing beneath the black tarps did not care in the least what any of them thought of it. The broker or the baron or the boy who climbed the fence. Down in the poison dark of the Bristow tract and soil laced through with half a century of silver mine venom, Della Hargrove's crop was waking to itself, and it was hungry, and it had been bred and coaxed and engineered across long years for exactly the terrible meal that ruined ground alone could set before it. July came down over the Cinnabar Basin like a heavy iron lid dropped onto a pot. It was the old men at the diner agreed each morning with a certain grim relish, the worst drought the region had suffered in more than 40 years, and they said so with the peculiar satisfaction of men for whom a disaster large enough to break the old records at least offers the consolation of being part of something historic. The sky bleached out from its deep summer blue to the flat white of an old bone left in a field. The irrigation canals that fed Rourke's green empire dropped and dropped and dropped again until the great main laterals that had run knee-deep and cold in June carried only a muddy sucking inch of water, and the ancient head gates his grandfather had stolen fair and square from a bribed judge gulped and sucked at the air. The alfalfa that was Emmett Rourke's pride, and the visible measure of his standing, went from deep emerald to a sick curling, chlorotic yellow in the span of 2 short weeks, and every single acre of it that browned and lay down took another thin fold of skin off the man's temper. He walked his dying fields in the long evenings with a jaw clenched hard as a fist, and his hired hands learned to find urgent work at the far opposite end of whatever field their employer happened to be walking. Across the barbed line on the ground that could not raise a thistle, the plainly impossible was underway. Della Hargrove rolled back the black tarps in the second week of July, and what lay revealed beneath them stopped the breath in the chest of every man who slowed his truck on the county road to see it. It was not wheat, It was not corn, nor soybean, nor bean, nor any green and ordinary thing that grew in that country, nor so far as any man who saw it could say in any country that a sane person had ever traveled through. It was a low, dense, aggressively sprawling carpet of foliage, the deep bruised color of a struck plum purple, gone very nearly to black in the long slanting light of evening, and every single leaf of the vast expanse of it wore a fine silver. Down a coat of tiny hairs that caught the hard sun and threw it back in a shifting shimmer, so that the whole 500 acres of the field seemed to breathe and ripple in the heat haze like the flank of some enormous animal lying asleep in the sun. And it was thriving. That was the part that turned the watching men's simple confusion over into something colder and closer to fear. While Rourke's own genetically engineered alfalfa lay down and died of pure thirst, not 200 yards away across the wire, this bruised dark thing on the dead poison ground swelled visibly larger day over day, fattening and spreading in the exact killing heat that was laying waste to every green and growing thing for 40 miles in every direction. The drought was no hardship at all to the purple crop. The drought plainly was a feast set out before it. Stranger even than the crop itself was what was happening to the ground that held it, and this was the part the farmers of the basin simply could not leave alone, could not stop chewing over at the counter, because a farmer will forgive a neighbor a strange crop, but he can never forgive strange dirt, dirt being the one thing he believes down in his marrow that he truly understands. Where the purple roots drove their way down into the earth, the cracked, pale poison of the old Bristow tract was turning. It was going dark. It was going rich and black, a deep chocolate loam that a man's boot would have sunk into a full inch. And it held moisture, actual moisture, in the middle of a July so dry, it had cracked the bed of the county reservoir into a mosaic of curling clay tiles. When Wyatt Poole crept the hot fence line one final time in the dead brutal heat of that month before his nerve failed him for good, and knelt at the edge of the transformed ground and took a single handful of that black loam up to his young face to smell it, he swore afterward to anyone in the valley who would stand still and listen that he had felt the dirt move against his palm, that it had been warm to the touch, warmer than the day around it, that it had hummed against his skin like a fence wire, with the current running live through it. The boy had never had the schooling to say in proper words what it was he had held cupped in his hand that afternoon. But he had the pure animal sense God gives a young creature to know that the stuff was alive in a way that dirt has no earthly business being alive. And he did not sleep an easy night for a long while after. And he never did tell Emmett Rourke the half of what he had felt. Rourke, for his own part, had come loose at every seam over the color spreading across his fence line. He stood out on his back porch at first light every single morning that dying summer, with a pair of high-powered binoculars pressed to his face, staring across the flat at that impossible purple sea, and what had begun back in the spring as mere annoyance had rotted and soured in the airless heat of that record summer into something that walked right up to the border of madness and looked over. He could not eat for looking at it. His grandfather's stolen water was dying to a trickle in the ditches. His empire was going yellow acre by browning acre. And there, on the worthless silver poison scar, he had waited 11 long years to fold into his own holdings. A silent woman who would not speak to a living soul was raising a crop that drank the killing drought down like a gift of spring rain. It violated every last natural law that Emmett Rourke had built the whole edifice of his life upon, and a man of Rourke's particular making, brought hard up against the thing that shatters his laws, does not stop to question whether the laws themselves might have been too small. He goes instead immediately, and with relief, looking for the crime. "She's stealing our water," his voice low and vicious to his foreman across the tailgate of a truck. One blue dusk, the two of them standing and staring at the far shimmer of the purple field. There is no other reading a sane man could put on it. She's tapped a pocket of the aquifer that we never charted, some deep pool nobody knew was under there, or else she's running a siphon line off the main county canal at night, buried under the road where nobody'd think to look. Nothing on God's green earth grows like that in a drought like this one. Nothing does and nothing can. She is stealing my water, and I'm going to prove that she is stealing it, and I'm going to take that ground back with her, sitting in a county cell where she can watch me do it through the bars. The foreman said not one word in answer, because the foreman had once been past that fence line at close range on an errand for Rourke he did not enjoy recalling. And he had smelled the hot copper and the burnt sugar rolling off that field in the heat, in some deep and sensible and self-preserving part of the man, had quietly decided that he wanted no part and no share of whatever it was that grew out there, water thief or witch or something with no name at all. It was Emmett Rourke who moved first to open violence, and he moved to it exactly the way powerful men move to violence, the world over, which is to say, at a careful remove from his own hands, using a boy's hands in place of his own. On a black, moonless night at the very tail end of July, he sent young Wyatt Poole and a second older ranch hand back over the fence, the two of them lugging between them 50 gallons of the most savage, non-selective herbicide. The cooperative stocked the sort of chemical that would scorch a fence line down to bare, sterile dirt and hold it barren for 2 full growing seasons. The instructions Rourke gave were simple and complete. Find the main trench, the central artery that fed the whole strange field, and pour the entire 50 gallons of poison down into it. Kill the abomination at its root and be done. Emmett Rourke went to his bed that night for the first time in a solid month with the deep and total ease of a man who is fully satisfied that he has at last solved his problem, and he rose before the dawn and carried his coffee out onto the porch and lifted his binoculars to his eyes with a smile already forming on his mouth, hungry and ready to feast his gaze upon a blackened, wilted, poisoned wasteland where the purple insult had stood. The smile did not survive his first clear look through the glasses. The crop had not died. Not 1 acre of it had died. Where the 50 gallons of poison had gone down into the earth, the purple had surged upward in answer. The foliage all along the central trench had thickened and reared up overnight into towering, knotted, glossy stalks that stood a full head taller than the rest of the field, gorged and dark and obscenely healthy. And Emmett Rourke understood with a cold and sickening lurch, dropping through the pit of his stomach, that the herbicide he had spent good money and a boy's nerve to murder the field had gone down into it instead, like a shot of strong whiskey poured into a starving man. The thing had not merely survived as poison, it had drunk the poison down and grown drunk and vast and towering upon the drinking of it, and now it stood there in the pale dawn light, fat and glossy with his own malice, thriving on the very venom he had meant to end it with. Rourke lowered the binoculars slowly from his face with hands that were no longer entirely steady, and for the first time in 11 unquestioned years, the great flat certainty that governed his whole life developed a hairline crack straight down its middle, and through that thin crack, cold and thin as ditch water in March, seeped the first draft of genuine fear. He was not that summer the only soul in the basin whose sleep the purple field had begun to steal away in the dark. Della Hargrove slept very little now, and what little she managed was less true rest than a kind of standing vigilance behind closed eyes. She had grown gaunt across the long, solitary summer of her labor, the flesh drawn down close over the fine bones of her face, and her hands were wrapped and rewrapped in strips of rag bandage, where the sap and the caustic ash and the ceaseless killing work had worn the very skin from her palms and left the meat beneath raw and weeping. She tended the whole of the crop entirely alone now. The gray-shirted crew had packed up their camper and driven out of the state weeks before their walls built, and their trenches dug and their contract complete, and everything that remained to be done, the whole 500 acres of it was hers and hers alone to carry on her 2 ruined hands. In the very deepest part of the night, when even the parched drought wind lay down at last, and the whole basin went silent, as a held breath, she would walk the length of the central trench with the respirator hanging loose and unbuckled at her throat, and she would stop now and again and take out from the inner breast pocket of her heavy canvas coat a small thing that she let no living soul on the earth ever see. It was small enough to close a fist around, and she would stand with it there in the floodlit dark, her back turned to the dead man's sagging house in the sleeping town beyond it. Her face lifted and turned to the east toward a horizon she could not possibly see across all those hundreds of dark miles, and would not in any case have named aloud. And whatever it was she said in those moments to the small thing in her hand, or to the darkness, or to the memory that the small thing carried in it, she said too quietly for the wind to catch it up and carry the words down to Redfern where they had already begun. Over their morning coffee and eggs, to wonder aloud to one another what in the name of God Almighty was growing behind Della Hargrove's wall. For it had not escaped the notice of the basin that something out on that tract had shifted as the summer wore on toward its end. The unmarked trucks still came grinding in at night, but now they went out again, as well as in, and what went out from the Bristow gate in the smallest hours went shrouded under heavy tarps of its own, riding on secured trailers bound away toward the interstate. The floodlights behind the wall burned later into the night than they ever had, and once on a still and windless night, when sound carried across the flat, the way sound only ever carries in the dead heart of a long drought, a man driving his truck home late along the county road swore on his mother's grave that he had heard it a sound coming from somewhere behind the Bristow fence, low and steady, and felt in the body as much as it was heard with the ear. A deep resonant thrum that came up through his tires and up through the seat springs and into the very bones of him and set his back teeth to aching in his jaw. He told the story of it at the diner counter the next morning, and two of the men there laughed at him, and one of them did not laugh at all. And Ruth Ann Pruitt, moving down the row refilling the cups, kept her own counsel and her own growing unease to herself, and let her eyes go once more to the far gray line of the wall through the window glass and felt the loose thread that had first snagged in her back in the spring pull slowly, steadily tight. Emmett Rourke had failed to poison the thing with the strongest chemical the cooperative sold. He was not a man built to fail twice at the same locked door, not a man who could suffer his own defeat and simply live alongside it. If the field would not die by chemistry, then he would find some older and surer poison than any the co-op stocked on its shelves to kill it, with a poison brewed in courthouses and county offices. And he began in those last airless black nights of July to reach his hand toward it. He had spent the whole of his life learning by heart which men in that closed country could be leaned upon and which could be bought outright. And he understood better than he understood the boundaries of his own stolen water rights, that there was always more than one road by which a determined man could take a piece of ground away from a woman who would not sell it. The 50 gallons of herbicide had been the very last thing he ever tried in the honest dark, with his own hands and his own risk. Everything that came after it, every move in the long game still to be played, he would work through other men's hands dressed up in something that looked to a careless and trusting eye a very great deal like the law. But that reckoning belonged to the weeks still ahead to the raid and the reagent strip and the impossible thing the state's own hired man would say aloud on his knees in the dirt with all the color running out of his face. For now, in the last suffocating nights of that record July, the whole basin simply held its breath and waited. The drought pressed down without mercy. The reservoir bed cracked and curled. Rourke watched from his porch through the glasses with a hatred that had long since lost the clean, comprehensible shape of ordinary greed and taken on, instead, the shapeless, gnawing form of pure need. Barrett Vance's paid investigator sat in an office in Boise, working a file that thickened by the day into a document that would change the price of absolutely everything. And behind 10 feet of high tensile wire on the same ground that a good stubborn man had died believing was worthless. Della Hargrove walked her rows alone in the dark with a small hard thing closed in her ruined hand, tending a crop that drank down poison and thrived upon drought and hummed in the deep earth like a secret with a beating heart. Waiting with a bottomless patience that ought to have frightened every last man in the Cinnabar Basin, a great deal more than it did for the harvest that she had crossed an entire country and buried an entire life to bring at last up out of the poisoned ground. She had not come to that ruined ground for money, though every single man who would soon try to take her harvest from her simply assumed that she had, and that lazy assumption was the very first stone laid in the foundation of the trap that would ruin them all. She had come instead for a promise she had made to someone who was no longer among the living to hold her to it, and she meant to keep that promise, though the whole of the basin should burn to the wire around her in the keeping. The men who slowed their trucks along the county road saw only a strange purple field, a locked steel gate, and a gaunt, silent woman who would not so much as return a wave. They did not see the thing that she saw when she stood at the edge of her rows and looked out over that impossible crop, drinking down the poison of the dead ground. They did not see a debt of honor being paid to the dead, but they would all of them come to learn, before the first hard frost of November came down over the valley, that there is no force loose upon this earth more patient or more purely dangerous than a quiet person who has already decided in full clarity exactly what they are willing to lose and who has nothing whatsoever left in the world to be afraid of. On the very last night of that month, Della stood at the head of the central trench at the exact place where the 50 gallons of poison had gone down into the earth and the crop had risen up glossy and towering to spite it. And she watched the great knotted stalks sway and move against the hard summer stars. And she let herself for one single moment and no longer feel the true size of the thing that she had made in that ground. It frightened even her, and she was the one who had bred it seed by seed. Somewhere in the dark behind her, the dead man's ruined house creaked and settled in the cooling air. Somewhere far to the east, past the black rim of the visible world, lay everything she had left behind her to come to this place. The gleaming laboratories, the clean glass, the soft-spoken men in their good suits who had sat across a table from her and decided with a pencil and a sheet of figures that a cure was worth a great deal more to them buried in the dark than it would ever be worth sold into the light. She closed her ruined hand around the small, hard thing in her breast pocket until the sharp edges of it bit down into her palm. Not this time. Her voice barely stirring the still night air, meant for no living ear, meant for someone the earth had already taken. This time it comes up out of the ground, and there is not a man on God's earth who is ever going to put it back down into the dark again. Then she drew the respirator up over her face, and she went down alone into the rows to work, and the floodlights burned white behind the wall until the eastern sky went the pale gray of ash, and the basin, sleeping and suspicious and altogether doomed, had not the faintest idea what was coming toward it out of that poison field. Down in Redfern, Ruth Ann Pruitt woke before her alarm clock, the way she had woken every single morning of that dry, strange summer, and she carried her first cup of coffee to stand at her kitchen window and look north across the flat toward the Bristow tract, where a faint white glow still hung in the air above the fence line in the last of the retreating dark. She had served Emmett Rourke his eggs and his certainties across her counter for 30 years and more. She had stood at that counter and watched 3 separate men break themselves to pieces on that cursed ground, and had gone to the funeral of the one of them the ground had finally killed outright. She did not know any more than the men who laughed at their own fear over her coffee knew what it was. The silent woman behind the wall was growing out there in the dark. But Ruth Ann Pruitt had lived a long time and buried a good many people. And she knew in her bones the difference between a person who is running away from something and a person who is walking with grim purpose toward it, and she had seen in the one single glimpse she had gotten of Della Hargrove's face through the diner window, on the day the woman came to town to sign her papers at the recorder's office, the particular terrible stillness of someone who has already made her private peace with the full cost of what she has set out to do. Ruth Ann set down her cup on the sill. She had the sudden, groundless, wholly unshakable feeling that the entire basin was standing at the top of a long, steep grade with its brakes already going soft under the pedal, and that all of them, the deacon and the elevator men, and the surveyor with the ruined hip, and Emmett Rourke with his 10,000 acres and his grandfather's stolen water, were about to find out together exactly how far down that grade ran. She was right in the feeling. She had only the season of it wrong. It would come to them worse than she feared, and it would come a great deal faster than she could have guessed. And when it finally broke over the heads of the whole valley that November, it would leave a smoking crater in the dead ground where the miracle had briefly been, and not one single soul among them crawling in the frozen dark with their coffee cans full of stolen dirt would ever fully understand the size of what it was they had lost. That was all of it still ahead. For now there was only the drought in the white glow hanging above the fence and the gaunt woman alone in the rows and the thing coming up dark and patient and hungry out of the poisoned ground. The basin had given her 3 months to fail in. She had taken the 3 months and every day beyond them. She had turned the very worst dirt in the American West into the single richest secret in the country, and she had done the whole of it alone in the dark behind a wall. And the men who had laughed at her over their morning eggs were very shortly going to stop their laughing for good and all. The wind came up off the ridge as the sky paled toward morning, and it carried down toward the sleeping town the faint, far smell of hot copper and something sweet burning somewhere. And Ruth Ann Pruitt shut her kitchen window against the smell of it and could not for the whole of her long life have told you why her two hands were shaking on the sill. The file that landed on Barrett Vance's desk in Boise in the second week of August was thicker by far than any dossier the man had ever paid to have compiled, and it changed him the precise way a grave diagnosis changes a man, cleaving his whole life into the hours that had come before he opened its cover, and the altogether different hours that came after. He had gone in expecting a page, perhaps two, on some farm-mad recluse, a story of a bad divorce, or a crushing debt, or some other small, sad private ruin that had driven a broken woman out to the ends of the earth to hide behind a fence. What his investigator had laid before him instead read like the assembled dossier of a person who had been deliberately professionally erased from the record. There were whole years simply missing out of the middle of her life. There were travel records that stopped short mid-sentence as though a door had been closed on them. There was a resume that climbed like a marble staircase up into the highest floors of a world that Barrett Vance had only ever read about in the back pages of the business papers. And then at the very top of that climb, it simply ended, cut off clean and sharp, as though the woman who had spent her life building it had walked out of a high window into empty air 5 years before and never once come down to earth again. Della Hargrove had not been born to canvas work coats and 12-gauge shotguns and poison dirt. Before the Bristow tract, before the basin, before ever, she was the strange, gaunt woman who would not speak to a soul she had been. Dr. Della Hargrove, the lead biochemist on a botanical research program, buried 3 full levels deep inside the organizational chart of Alderman Voss, a pharmaceutical concern quietly registered in the state of Delaware, a firm with laboratories that no journalist alive had ever managed to photograph. The file had photographs the journalists had never gotten. A younger Della standing in a clean room suit behind a wall of glass, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, her hands bare and unscarred and whole, bent with an expression of pure absorption over a rack of small seedlings that glowed faintly under the grow lamps in a shade of deep bruised purple that Barrett Vance had last seen shimmering under the hard July sun on the far side of a chain-link fence. He sat with that one photograph for a very long time. Then he made himself read the rest of what the file contained, and the rest was worse, or it was very much better, depending entirely on which of Barrett Vance's several competing appetites a man happened to be asking. And by the time he finally closed the folder over and set it down on his desk, his soft hands had developed the fine betraying tremor of a gambler who has just seen lying face up on the green felt in front of him. The one single card in the entire deck that cannot be beaten by any hand. Whatever it was that grew behind that wall out in the basin, it was not a crop. It was the escaped and stolen property of one of the most secretive corporations on the whole of the continent, and the woman who had walked off with it and now raised it in secret had most certainly not bought the ruined Bristow tract because the dirt came cheap at a tax sale. She had bought that particular parcel of ground because it was poisoned, and for no other reason on earth. Barrett Vance understood the whole shape of it now with the same cold clarity that had made him a wealthy man, understood it the very way he understood a market, the instant before it turned the heavy metals soaked deep into that ruined ground. The silver mine venom that had bankrupted 3 honest working men and driven the last of them to a bullet were not the enemy of Della's purple crop at all. They were its fuel, its meat. She had needed the single most toxic acreage in the American West, because whatever it was she had carried out of the Alderman Voss laboratories sealed inside those 3 padlocked shipping containers could not so much as live without it. Fed upon it, transmuted it, breathed it in, and turned it into something else entirely. And a thing that could reach down into 50 years of industrial poison and spin it into whatever it was that made a corporation register its laboratories in Delaware and photograph absolutely nothing of what went on inside them. A thing like that was not worth a forward contract signed at a farm gate. It was worth exactly as the woman herself had told him, with the shotgun riding the crook of her arm a vault. Barrett Vance had driven up into that basin meaning to skim the cream off some quaint niche crop. He now understood with total clarity that he had blundered instead into the near vicinity of a fortune with no ceiling at all upon it. And there is no narcotic known to man more dangerous in its effects than that exact species of clarity working in the mind of a man who has already privately decided that the world owes him a debt. Word of what was in the file did not stay quietly in Boise because Barrett Vance was constitutionally not a man capable of sitting alone atop a secret of that magnitude, and because the whole of the basin that hot, dead August had somehow become a place where secrets went specifically in order to die. He made calls. He made them with care to a certain sort of man he knew who trafficked quietly in the recovery of misplaced property, but he made them in a whisper of what he had learned drifted back over the ridge on the hot, dry wind, the way every last thing eventually drifted in that closed country, and the whisper found its way at last to the one man in the entire Cinnabar Basin most perfectly primed and positioned to weaponize it. Emmett Rourke had passed the 2 weeks since his herbicide failed him in a state of mind that his own hired hands had quickly learned to give the widest possible berth. The poison that ought by every law of nature to have blackened and killed the field had instead only fattened it grotesquely. Every single morning the purple sea across his fence line stood a little taller, a little glossier, a little more insolently and impossibly alive, while his own alfalfa lay down in windrows of curling yellow ruin, while his grandfather's stolen water ran its thin, muddy thread in the bottom of the ditch, while the record drought that was steadily breaking him fed and fattened the very thing that stood there mocking him from across the wire. He had failed at chemistry. He would not, he swore to himself in the long, sleepless nights, fail at law. And when the drifting whisper of Barrett Vance's file finally reached his straining ear, Emmett Rourke saw at once with the clarity of the truly desperate the precise shape of the heavy club he had been groping blindly after in the dark for weeks. He did not in the least care what the crop across his fence actually was. He had no need to care. He needed only a story ugly enough and frightening enough to bring the full crushing weight of the state down upon that wall, and a silent woman raising some strange, unnatural mutant thing under floodlights in the dead of night, behind a steel wall that the federal government itself might have envied, handed him the single ugliest story going in that whole God-fearing country. "She's cooking dope out there, Hollis." His verdict delivered flat across the wide desk of Sheriff Hollis Trant. In the county seat, the office door shut fast, and the two of them alone behind it. Some new engineered strain of the stuff opium or worse, something spliced up in a laboratory to yield like nothing that God ever set growing in a field. Why else in the name of sense does a woman string 10 full feet of steel wire around 500 acres of pure nothing? Why else does she work that ground only in the dead of night, sealed up in a gas mask? Why else in this world won't she let one single living soul pass that gate of hers? He let the question settle into the man across the desk. He knew his sheriff to the ground. You raid that tract, Hollis, and you don't just make the single biggest narcotic seizure this sorry county has ever seen in its history. You make that seizure under civil forfeiture. That parcel, every improvement she's sunk into it, every piece of equipment behind that fence, all of it falls straight to the county the very day you prove up what she's growing out there. It falls to your office, to your department's budget, to you, Hollis. Rourke leaned slowly back in his chair, the trap set, and baited now with the one single bait that had never once in the history of the world failed to take a certain breed of lawman. Me, I'm just a concerned neighbor doing his plain civic duty, reporting a suspicion to the proper authority. What you decide to do with the information, why, that's entirely your own business. Hollis Trant was a large man gone soft and heavy through the middle, across the span of a long and deeply cynical career. A man who had learned very early in the wearing of a badge that the true harvest to be reaped from the office was never justice but leverage, and who had spent the better part of 20 years since quietly turning other men's small trespasses and smaller sins into his own private and comfortable gains. He kept a forfeiture account down at the county that he was privately proud of. He kept a courthouse full of clerks and commissioners who feared the sight of him coming. What Hollis Trant did not keep anywhere about his person was the simple good sense to stop and wonder why Emmett Rourke, a man who had never in his entire self-serving life performed a single civic duty that did not pay him back, at double the cost, had grown so suddenly and so tenderly concerned for the drug laws of the Cinnabar Basin. Greed answered greed across that desk, as greed had always answered greed in that country since the first bribe was paid to the first crooked judge, and the two men shook hands on it over the blotter, and a warrant was drawn up on an affidavit stitched together out of nothing but Emmett Rourke's malice and a 16-year-old boy's midnight hearsay, and the raid was set down for a blistering Tuesday in the middle of August, when the heat stood in the dying fields like standing water and shimmered up off the county road in sheets. They came in force because force, in the show of it, was the entire point. A convoy of 6 county cruisers threw up a rooster tail of pale dust, a full mile long behind them as they tore down the rutted Bristow lane, their light bars strobing uselessly against the flat white glare of noon, their sirens screaming full-throated into the dead-still air where there was no traffic anywhere to part and no living soul to warn. Behind the 6 county cars ran 2 unmarked state SUVs because Hollis Trant had made a few careful calls of his own in the days before, and he wanted this particular seizure witnessed by outside men, and the credit for it spread thin enough across enough shoulders that no single blame could ever come to stick on his. Out of the lead cruiser heaved the sheriff himself, one heavy hand riding the butt of his holstered sidearm out of long habit, rather than any real expectation of need, the sweat already showing dark through the back of his uniform shirt before his boots hit the gravel. Out of the second cruiser climbed a man who did not belong to any part of it. A slight, careful, bookish figure in a nylon windbreaker with a state crime lab crest embroidered over the breast, carrying a hard-sided case of delicate instruments, and wearing on his mild face the plain expression of a person who would have given a year's salary to be anywhere else on the surface of the earth. His name was Dr. Elias Farrow, and he was the forensic botanist that the state kept on quiet retainer for exactly the sort of clandestine narcotic seizure that Hollis Trant fully believed he was about to make. And Elias Farrow would walk off the Bristow track that afternoon, a fundamentally different man than the one who had walked onto it, unmade and then remade entirely in the span of a single hour by nothing more than a narrow strip of chemically treated paper. Della was waiting for them on the sagging porch when the dust of the convoy settled a chipped mug of black coffee cooling slowly in her bandaged hands, and she did not look in the least surprised to see them come, which unnerved the assembled deputies a great deal more than a locked and barricaded door ever could have. She looked, if she looked like anything at all, simply tired, far past the reach of ordinary sleep, hollowed out clear to the bone by a whole summer of solitary labor, the dark circles standing out beneath her eyes, the deep color of a day-old bruise. She watched the convoy of cars fan out across her gravel apron with the flat, patient, unhurried attention of a woman watching the players take their marks in a play whose final act she had already read to the end and set down. She lifted her mug and took a slow swallow and set it back down upon the porch rail. She did not once glance toward the shotgun leaning in the corner behind her. That single fact, more than anything else about her stillness, should have sent every last one of them straight back to their cars. Trant heaved his bulk up to the foot of the porch steps with a folded paper thrust out ahead of him like a shield held up against a blow. Della Hargrove, by order of the county court, we are here to execute a search and seizure warrant upon this property on the sworn suspicion of the manufacture and cultivation of a controlled substance. His voice pitched high to carry, pitched deliberately for the state men listening behind him, pitched most of all for the official record of the thing. Now you are going to stand aside and let my people go about their lawful work here, or you are going to be removed from your own porch in handcuffs. Those are the 2 roads that lie open to you, and you may take your pick. Tread lightly out there, Sheriff. Her voice came out soft, almost gentle pitch so low that the nearest deputy felt the hair rise on the back of his neck without any earthly notion of why it should. She lifted the mug once more, took another slow and unhurried swallow, set it down again on the rail. The soil out in that field is a great deal more sensitive than a man of your training has the first capacity to imagine. You send your people in there swinging blades, and you will most surely answer for every last thing that comes of it. I will not have it said afterward that I did not stand right here and warn you plain. Trant only sneered at the warning because a sneer was the whole of the man's answer to anything in this world that he could not immediately turn to his own profit, and he flung out an arm and waved his deputies forward into the field. They went in the way lawmen the world over go into a place they have already tried and convicted in their own minds as a den of criminals without care and without reverence. Machetes and canvas evidence bags swinging loose from their fists, hacking down at the towering purple stalks to lay them open for the botanist's kit. The very first blade that bit clean through a main stalk released the smell into the noon heat all at once. That dense, overpowering reek of hot-struck copper cut straight through with a scorched, cloying sweetness, thick enough in the still air to send two of the deputies stumbling backward, gagging into their own sleeves. And what bled out from the severed stalks where the blades had opened them was not the green or the milky white sap of any honest plant those men had ever cut in their lives. It came out crimson, luminous, and thick as arterial blood, and it ran down the raw, cut faces of the stems and pooled steaming in the dark, rich loam at their boots. And the deputies who had gone in laughing and swinging a moment before went all at once very quiet and stood there and looked at one another across the fresh wounds they had opened in the field. Elias Farrow knelt down in the dirt where the deputies had cleared him a working space, his kit open on a clean folded cloth beside his knee, his hands betraying an unsteadiness that he was privately ashamed of and could not for the life of him master. He had testified in a full 100 of these clandestine seizures across his career. He knew the whole grim familiar catalog of what desperate men grew in the dark of locked rooms and hidden fields, and he had come out to the basin that day fully expecting some engineered strain of cannabis or some clandestine plot of opium poppy, a thing that would slot neatly into one of the printed boxes on his standard state form. He drew up a sample of the luminous crimson sap onto a cotton swab. He took up a reagent test strip of the exact kind that had never one single time in all his years of fieldwork failed to tell him plainly and immediately what it was he was looking at. The kind of strip that flushed a clean chemical blue in the presence of alkaloids, a deep red for opiates, a whole indexed rainbow of chemical guilt keyed precisely to the signature of every narcotic that a man had ever cooked up in a basement or a barn. He touched the wet swab to the treated paper of the strip. He waited as he had waited 100 times for the paper to bloom with the color of a crime. The strip turned gold. Not the dull, weak yellow of a faint or partial reaction, not any hue at all that appeared anywhere on the printed reference chart glued inside the lid of his kit, but a blinding, metallic, wholly impossible gold, bright as a freshly struck coin, bright very nearly as the noon sun itself, a color that had no place whatsoever in the entire vocabulary of his science. Elias Farrow made a small strangled sound low in his throat and dropped the strip from his fingers as though it had gone suddenly red hot in his grip. He scrambled backward through the dirt on his hands and his heels, his eyes gone huge and white in his face, the blood draining steadily out of his cheeks until his skin was the exact ashen gray of the dead alkali that had once ruled that ground. Every deputy in the field stopped his hacking at once and turned to stare. Trant up at the field's edge, frowned down at the little state man crawling backward through the dirt like something venomous had struck him. Well, Trant's patience already worn thin, already curdling into the suspicion that his sure and certain thing was somehow going badly sideways in front of the state's witnesses. Is it dope or isn't it dope, Doc? What in the hell does the strip say? Farrow rose slowly up onto his knees. In one trembling hand, he still held a length of taproot that the deputies had torn free of the earth, a gnarled, heavy fist-thick piece of the stuff, and it pulsed faintly against his open palm with a low, steady warmth that had no earthly business being there, a warmth that no severed root has any right at all to hold on to minutes after the cutting. He stared down at it in his hand. Then he lifted his ruined ashen face up toward the porch, toward the silent woman standing there with her cooling coffee, as though she were somehow the only other person present on that whole tract who could possibly follow him to the terrible place his mind had suddenly gone. This isn't a narcotic, his voice barely more than a cracked breath forced out over dry lips. It isn't anything on my chart. It isn't anything on any chart that any man has ever printed. He turned the pulsing root slowly in the hard light, and the crimson welling at its severed end caught the sun and glowed. The cellular structure of it, it's pulling the heavy metals straight up out of this poisoned dirt, the silver, the arsenic, the whole toxic load of it, the 50 years of venom that killed every green thing anyone ever tried to plant in this ground, and it is converting them, refining them. It is spinning industrial poison into pure bioavailable rare earth enzyme compounds that do not occur anywhere in the natural world, that cannot occur in nature. He looked up at Trant, and then around at the ring of staring deputies, and then back down at the impossible, pulsing thing cradled in his own two hands. And what he said next fell into the dead noon air like a heavy stone dropped down a deep, dry well. Do you have the first idea in this world what you are standing in the middle of? This is a cure, Sheriff. This is a cure for cellular degeneration. A single ounce of this root is worth more than every last deed in this whole county, laid out end to end in a line. She is not growing dope out here in the dark. His voice broke fully apart on the words, now the awe and the terror braided together past any hope of separating them out again. She's growing a miracle, and you have just sent grown men into the middle of it with machetes to hack the thing to the ground. The silence that came down over the field in the wake of Pharaoh's declaration was total and complete. A silence with a real physical weight pressing down inside it, broken only by the dry scrape of the basin wind dragging itself along the steel wire of the fence. Every single man standing in that field understood in the space of one held breath that the ground had shifted clean out from under his boots, that he had come out there in a convoy to seize a common criminal, and had instead trespassed straight into the middle of something so far above his station and his understanding that the warrant folded in the sheriff's fist was not a legal instrument at all, but a bad joke. Hollis Trant felt the shift worst of all of them, and fastest, because Trant's entire cynical life had trained him precisely to read exactly this one moment. The moment when the true and hidden value of a thing finally reveals its face, and every last avaricious instinct the man owned came awake all at once and swung around to point in a single unwavering direction. He looked up at Della Hargrove standing there on her porch, unmoved and unhurried, watching him back over the rim of her mug with the flat, bottomless patience of a woman who has waited the whole long game through and has finally at last watched her opponent reach out his hand and lay one finger upon the exact piece she needed him to touch. Seal it! His voice cracked straight down the middle with the raw, new greed rising up hot inside it, and he turned to his deputies with a thick hand that was no longer steady, sweeping it in a wide arc toward the perimeter fence. Nobody in, nobody out. This entire tract is under full county quarantine as of this exact minute, pending a complete hazardous materials investigation to be conducted out of my office. That crop is evidence in an open investigation. That crop is county property from this moment until such time as I personally say otherwise. He had made the whole turn in the span of a single drawn breath, from drug raid to treasure claim, from sworn lawman to a common looter wearing a badge, and he had not the grace nor the self-awareness left in him to feel even a flush of shame at how fast his soul had made the trade. You do not have the jurisdiction to quarantine a federally sanctioned bio-research site, Sheriff. Della Hargrove's voice carried clean and effortless the full length of the yard, without her once seeming to raise it at all, and it stopped Hollis Trant's sweeping hand dead in the air. She came down off the porch steps, unhurried one at a time, and reached into the inner breast of her heavy canvas coat and drew out a thick sealed envelope, heavy with the wax and the ribbon of a court that did not answer to any county government anywhere in the state. She did not walk it over and hand it to him. She tossed the envelope underhand into the dirt at his boots so that he would have to bend his soft, heavy body down for it, so that every deputy and every state witness standing in that yard would see the sheriff of the Cinnabar Basin stoop over in the dirt. That is a standing injunction out of the Ninth Circuit, signed by a federal judge and effective from the precise moment your first deputy laid a hand on my fence. It classifies every square foot of this ground as a secure federal research facility. Read the seal, Sheriff. Her eyes came up and settled on him colder by far than the coffee going cold on the rail behind her. You and every man you brought have exactly 60 seconds to be standing on the far side of that gate. Stay one single heartbeat past that, and by tomorrow morning, federal marshals will be down here, taking your department apart, badge by badge and pension by pension, and there will not be a forfeiture account deep enough in this state to save your neck. Trant bent. There in front of all of them, he bent his heavy body down and picked the envelope up out of the dirt, and his thick fingers fumbled and tore at the wax seal. And he read, and his sunburned face went first slack, and then a sick gray, and then something a good deal worse than gray, as the trap closed itself around him with a soft click he could very nearly hear. It was all of it true. Every single word on the page. She had not fought the raid at all. She had welcomed it in. She had stood on her porch with her coffee and let his own deputies, his own state, botanist, his own sworn official testimony document beyond any possible question. Right there on the public record, the exact nature and the full legitimacy of what grew behind her wall had let their own ignorant hands and mouths build her airtight case for her. And only then, only after their trespass had done her work, had she reached into her coat and slammed the heavy federal door and left the whole convoy of them standing there on the wrong side of it, holding a county warrant now worth a great deal less than the paper it had wasted. She had used the law itself exactly the way she had used the poison ground, taking the very thing they had brought to destroy her and feeding it in to fuel the engine of her own design. Hollis Trant understood standing there in the noon heat with the injunction shaking faintly in his grip that he had been played clean from the very moment his tires first touched the head of the lane, and that the silent woman who had played him so completely had never once had to raise her voice above a murmur to do it. "Off my land, Sheriff." The words dropped soft as ash into the ringing quiet. "The clock is running now, and I have documented every single second you have spent standing on it." He pulled his men out of the field. He had no other move left to him anywhere on the board, and Hollis Trant, whatever else he was, could count. The deputies filed back to the cruisers, dragging their machetes in the dirt behind them, casting long looks back over their shoulders at the wounded purple field, at the luminous crimson, still weeping, slow from the stalks they had opened, and Trant hauled his heavy body back into the lead car with the ruined dignity of a man who has grabbed with both greedy hands for a fortune and closed his fist instead on a summons. The convoy backed and turned and ground its slow way back out down the lane. The light bars gone dark now, and the sirens gone dead silent, and the pale dust of their leaving hung a long while in the still noon air, settling slow over the crop they could not touch and the woman they had proven with their own mouths they could not move. But the damage was already done, and Della Hargrove had known that it would be, had built her whole plan squarely upon the certainty of it, because a secret witnessed and documented by a full dozen sworn lawmen and one loose-tongued state scientist is no secret left in the world at all. Elias Farrow was a weak-willed man with a mild face that hid nothing that passed behind it, and terror and wonder are between them two of the very least discreet passions a human being is ever asked to carry. He did not so much as make it back to the county seat that afternoon before he had begun to talk first to the state men riding beside him in the SUV, and then that very same night in a low and shaking voice over a great many more drinks than a careful man would have taken at a roadhouse, out on the county line to a bartender who had a cousin whose wife worked the front counter down at the Red Fern Feed Cooperative. By the time the sun came up the next morning over the basin, the true nature of the thing behind Della Hargrove's wall was loose and running in the Cinnabar Basin, and the basin, which had laughed at her all through the spring and had come to fear her all through the summer, went in the span of that single day entirely and dangerously mad. At Ruth Ann Pruitt's diner, the change in the air was total and immediate, a whole community's moral weather turning clean over between one breakfast service and the next. The same men who had chuckled comfortably over Emmett Rourke's 3 months prophecy back in the spring now huddled close over the counter with their heads bent together, whispering low and urgent of the devil's root out on the Bristow tract, the root that turned pure poison into gold, that reversed the slow ruin of a dying human body. The same miraculous way it reversed the ancient ruin of the poisoned ground that could reach into a man at death's door and hand him back the lost years of his life. Someone's aunt over in the next county had the wasting disease that no doctor could halt. Someone's own father had gone down that winter to a tremor that 3 specialists in 2 states could not so much as put a name to. Someone had read or had heard or had simply invented whole and passed it on as gospel, that a single dose of the stuff Della Hargrove grew in her poison field could raise a person clean up off a deathbed and set them walking out under their own power. The stories fed and grew fat upon one another exactly the way the crop itself fed and grew fat upon poison swelling, monstrous in each retelling, and Ruth Ann stood behind her counter pouring coffee she scarcely remembered pouring, listening to 30 years of neighbors she had believed she knew down to the bone, talk themselves cup by refilled cup clean out of the last of their good Christian sense. There is a woman sitting out there right now with a cure for death itself behind a chain-link fence. She overheard and could not afterward have said which of the familiar faces at her counter had spoken it, and the law has proven it can't lay a finger on her, and she won't sell so much as a single grain of it to a dying man, and every last one of us is going to stand around in here and let ourselves and our people rot in the ground while she does it. The words hung there over the counter in the coffee steam, like the smell rolling off that far field, and Ruth Ann Pruitt felt the loose thread that had been slowly pulling tight in her all summer long. Finally snapped clean through, felt the whole basin tip at last over the top of the long steep grade. She had feared its brakes gone soft, gathering speed toward the bottom. She thought of the deacon who whispered at the end of her counter. She thought of the two mild brothers who ran the elevator scale. She thought of the old surveyor with the twice-ruined hip who came in every single morning of his life for the same plate of eggs and the same weak decaf. She looked around at their faces, greedy and frightened, and lit from somewhere within by a wild hope that had already curdled over into a wilder hunger, and she understood with a cold certainty that turned her stomach that there was not one single man left in that whole warm room she could any longer trust to leave another person's fence alone in the dark. The hardware stores told the rest of the story without needing a single word spoken over a counter. Within 2 short days, the shelves in Redfern and in the 2 nearest towns down the highway stood stripped entirely bare of bolt cutters, of heavy-duty flashlights, and the batteries to feed them of work gloves and pry bars, and the cheap tactical gear that a certain breed of man goes out and buys only when he has already privately decided to do a thing in the dark of night that he would never once dare to do in the honest light of day. The owner of the Redfern Hardware, a decent man who had known the great majority of his customers since they were all boys running the same schoolyard, rang up sale after grim sale with a growing dread rising in him that he could not quite have put a name to because he understood in his gut precisely what a sudden run on bolt cutters and dark lanterns meant in a county where every last living soul now knew that there was one single fence and one only, that a man might grow rich by cutting. Old men who had never so much as jaywalked in their long, law-abiding lives were quietly arming themselves for a night's felony trespass. Fathers were bent over kitchen tables, teaching grown sons the geometry of a chain-link barrier. The whole of the basin was making itself ready quietly and feverishly, and all at once to storm a wall in the dark. And behind that wall, Della Hargrove tended her rows and checked her instruments and let them come, every last one of them, because the frenzy she had so deliberately unleashed upon the valley was itself a working part of the plan. The covering noise and the covering chaos that would mask the one true and silent move she had been building towards since the first night the containers came off the trailer. No man in the whole basin was consumed by the madness more wholly or more terribly than Emmett Rourke. The raid that he himself had engineered from behind his desk to destroy the woman had instead served only to crown her, had established beyond any argument, and right there on the permanent public record, that the worthless silver poison scar he had waited 11 patient years to steal for the price of a filing fee was in truth the single most valuable piece of ground in the entire country. And it lay there not 200 yards from his own back porch, walled off and federally protected, and forever, absolutely forever beyond the reach of his hand. His 10,000 acres, his grandfather's stolen water, the whole hard-built empire of the Rourke name, all of it had turned to gray ash in his mouth the very instant Elias Farrow knelt in the dirt and spoke aloud the word cure. He understood now, with a bitterness that ate steadily at the man the way the crimson sap ate through boot leather, exactly why she had bought the poison ground, why she had signed for it without reading past the legal description. He had thought her a pure fool for it back in the spring over his eggs. She had known from the very first, from long before the first truck ever turned in at the gate, that the venom soaked into that ruined dirt was not the enemy of her strange crop at all, but its very engine, the one essential catalyst without which the purple thing could not perform its impossible transmutation. And she had gone out searching across the whole of the West, specifically for the single most ruined and toxic acreage she could find, precisely because it was ruined. Precisely because no living man, and least of all a proud man like Emmett Rourke, would ever in 100 years imagine that a fortune without a ceiling could be raised up out of it. She had hidden the richest miracle in the world inside the one single thing that Emmett Rourke was too proud ever to look at twice. The sheer genius of the concealment maddened him past the last reach of his reason. He stood out on his porch through the long August evenings, staring across the flat at the purple sea, and where his hatred of the woman had once had the clean and comprehensible shape of ordinary greed, it now had only the shapeless, bottomless form of pure need. The need of a man who has been shown close enough to touch the one single thing in all the world that he can never have, and who finds that he cannot go on living quietly beside it. Desperation makes strange bedfellows of proud men, and as the season turned at last toward its close, as the first cold nights crept into the tail of October, and the leaves went off the few cottonwoods down along the dry creek, Emmett Rourke received a visitor his gate had never once expected to see. Barrett Vance came up the long ranch road in the immaculate silver sedan, with every last trace of the easy charm burned clean off of him, and behind Vance's car came a second vehicle, a black utility rig carrying three men who moved with the unhurried economy of the trade they plainly belonged to, and these three were led by a fourth man who did not so much enter Emmett Rourke's house as quietly occupy it. Vaughn Slate was a lean, unhurried man, with eyes the flat, dead gray of gunmetal, and the particular deep stillness that settles into a person who has done violence often enough and cleanly enough that the doing of it no longer requires any heat in him at all. He said very little. He let Barrett Vance do the talking, which was Vance's one remaining gift, and he stood by the cold hearth with his hands folded loosely before him and took the slow measure of Emmett Rourke, exactly the way a careful man takes the measure of a tool he may or may not have use for. Vance poured himself a generous glass from Rourke's own private bottle without troubling to ask the courtesy of it first, and he laid the whole shape of the thing out across Rourke's living room. You and I have got ourselves the very same problem, Emmett, and the answer to it is standing right there in the room beside us. A tilt of the heavy glass toward the window, toward the far white glow of the floodlights burning out on the Bristow tract. That crop out there is stolen property. It is not county property, and it is not federal property, whatever paper that woman waved in Hollis Trant's fat face. It belongs root and leaf and every last drop of that crimson sap to the people I used to draw a paycheck from a firm registered out of Delaware by the name of Alderman Voss and Della Hargrove walked straight out of their laboratories 5 years ago with their entire proprietary program riding inside her own head and their proprietary specimen line locked in a case under her arm. And there has not been one single day in the 5 years since that those people have not wanted it back. They are prepared to pay a recovery fee for the intact harvest of that field that would make your 10,000 acres out there look like the loose change a man leaves on a diner counter. Mr. Slate here is the instrument by which that recovery gets made. He has done this precise kind of work on 4 separate continents. What the man lacks, and the only thing he lacks, is the ground truth of this particular place. The local hands, the men who know that fence and that road and that field in the pitch dark. And that Emmett, that is exactly what you bring to the table. Rourke paced the length of his own floor like a caged and pacing thing torn straight down the middle, between the sheer staggering size of the number Vance had just dangled in front of him, and the sharp, fresh memory of the federal injunction that had turned Hollis Trant the color of a corpse. You saw with your own eyes what happened to Hollis. She has got the whole weight of the federal government wrapped around that fence, like her own coil of barbed wire. The very second any one of us so much as crosses that line, we are not fighting one lone woman anymore. We are fighting the government of the United States. The injunction protects the land from legal seizure. Vaughn Slate spoke for the very first time, and his voice was quiet and level and entirely without inflection, the voice of a man reading aloud a weather report from a distant county. It does not protect the perimeter from an undocumented breach in the night by parties unknown. There is a very great deal of daylight, Mr. Rourke, between the things the law forbids a man to do and the far smaller set of things the law can actually prove that a man has done. My entire professional life is lived out in that daylight. He unfolded a set of photographs onto the low table between them. Aerial shots taken by something that had flown far too high and far too quiet to be heard from the ground below. And the purple fields in those photographs were not the fields that Rourke saw every morning from his porch. They glowed. Even flattened onto a sheet of photographic paper, they glowed. The central trenches lit from within by a deep and pulsing crimson. The whole 500 acres of the tract humming visibly with some stored kinetic energy that the camera had somehow managed to catch and hold. She is very near to harvest. My instruments have read a sharp thermal spike coming up off those central rows 3 separate nights running now. The crop is reaching some form of biological maturity, and the moment that it does, she is going to move it. If those roots leave that ground on secured transport, then the window is shut for good and all, and the recovery fee goes with it, and so does your one and only chance to salvage a single thing out of the ruin she has made of your name and your empire. We breach the fence, and we do it soon. My team goes in first and neutralizes whatever system she has rigged. Your men come in behind and provide the labor to lift the crop up out of the ground before the sky goes gray. It is not a complicated piece of work, Mr. Rourke. It comes down in the end to one single question, and the question is whether or not you have got the stomach left in you for the one move on this board that actually pays. Rourke stood a long moment over the glowing photograph spread on his table, and whatever last small measure of caution still lived somewhere down inside the man. Whatever final quiet voice tried to warn him that the woman across the fence had welcomed one attack already with her cold coffee and her federal paper, and might just as easily be waiting to welcome a second drowned entirely in the rising flood of his avarice and his ruined pride. He thought of her standing on that porch unafraid and unmoved, watching him over the rim of her mug while she let him reach. He thought again of the number. He put out his hand and Von Slate took it in a grip that was cool and dry and wholly without any warmth in it at all. And the darkest bargain the Cinnabar Basin had ever known was struck and sealed over the private stock of a proud and desperate man. A bargain that would drag every last one of them in the black frozen hours of a coming November night, straight into the exact dead center of a trap that a mind colder and more patient than all of theirs stacked together had been quietly laying in place since the first unmarked truck turned in at the gate. Across the basin behind her wall, Della Hargrove felt them coming for her the way an old healed wound feels a change coming in the weather. She had no need of Slate's high-flying drones to tell her that the harvest was near. The crop itself told her plainly in the deepening thrum that came up now through the soles of her boots, at every hour of the day and night, in the fine crimson mist that had begun to sweat and bead from the purple leaves in the cool of the small hours, in the volatile kinetic hum that made the very air above the central rows shimmer and warp like the heat rising off a summer road. She walked the trenches in the cold dark with her respirator hanging unbuckled at her throat, checking and recording the readings off a bank of instruments she had buried beneath the rotting floorboards of the dead man's house, and she did the one thing she had done every single night of that long and terrible summer. She took the small hard thing out from the inner pocket of her coat, and she held it in her ruined and bandaged hand, and she turned her gaunt face east toward the country she had crossed the whole width of to get to this place. It was a photograph, worn soft at its 4 corners from years of handling, sealed now inside a small sleeve of plastic against the sweat of her palm. It showed a man's face. A face younger than her own had grown laughing openly at whoever it was that had held the camera, a lanyard hanging around his neck with an identification badge that she had carefully cut away out of the frame with a razor before she left, so that no one who might one day find her body in that field could ever trace the laughing man back to the laboratories. Marcus, her partner on the program, her partner in the long patient work, and in every other way that had ever mattered to either of them, the first mind on the whole team to truly see what the purple line could be made to do, to see it clearly before Alderman Voss had any real understanding of the thing they held sealed in their own vaults. The two of them had built it together side by side in the clean rooms behind the Delaware glass, and together they had watched it pull the poison up out of dead ground and spin that poison into the compound that could reach down into a failing and dying human cell and turn its dying around and send it back toward life. And together they had wept, actually wept. Standing there in their clean room suits the night the very first assays came back off the machine, because they had understood in that moment that they were holding in a single rack of glowing purple seedlings the end of a certain vast and ancient kind of human suffering. And then the firm had done its arithmetic. A cure the soft-spoken men in the good suits had patiently explained to the two of them across a wide table in a room that had no windows. Anywhere in its walls was from a purely business standpoint, a very poor sort of asset. A cure is sold to a sick man exactly one time, and then the man is well again and healthy, and he buys nothing further from you for the rest of his natural life. A treatment, by contrast, a managed therapy that held the degeneration in check without ever quite ending it, that kept a dying body alive and dependent, and paying quarter after quarter and year after year for the whole long remainder of its artificially extended and immensely profitable life. Now that was an asset a careful man could build an entire company upon. The program was to be quietly reoriented. The cure itself was to be buried, its data sealed away, its living purple line destroyed down to the last seedling. And a far lesser thing developed and patented in its place, a lifelong maintenance drug that would keep the sick of the world barely living and endlessly obediently buying. Marcus had fought them on it. Marcus had gone up over their heads to the board itself, had threatened in a room full of lawyers to carry what the two of them had built out into the light of the world, whether the firm approved of it or not. And Marcus had gotten sick in a strange and sudden manner that the firm's own well-paid doctors proved curiously unhurried ever to properly diagnose sick with the very cellular degeneration that their buried cure had been built to turn, and he had died of it across 11 long and wasting months, while the compound that would have saved his life sat sealed in a steel vault 3 floors directly below the room, where he lay dying because a living cure walking around in the world was worth a great deal less to Alderman Voss than a dead man's permanent silence. Della had held his hand at the very end of it. She had made him a promise in that room in the last hour of him that she had spent every single day since, keeping a promise she had carried across a whole country and buried a career and a name and a self to make good upon. They will not bury it. Her whisper pressed close against his ear in the last hour when he could no longer find the breath to answer her back. I swear it to you on everything I am. It comes up out of the ground where their lawyers cannot reach it, and it goes free to the people who are dying for the want of it, and no company on this earth ever puts it back down into the dark again. I will grow it in the worst dirt in the whole world if that is what it takes to keep it out of their vaults. I will not let them take it, and I will not stop, not for anything, not until it is out of my 2 hands and into the hands of the world. She had walked the proprietary specimen case straight out through the front doors of the laboratory the week after they buried him, carried it out past the very noses of men who never once in their lives imagined that quiet, grieving Dr. Hargrove would ever do a thing so violently unquiet as steal. And she had vanished with it into the wide country to keep a deathbed promise to the only man who had ever truly understood what the two of them had made. The crop was never, not for one single day, a fortune to her. It had never once been about the money that every greedy man in the basin assumed had brought her. It was a grave she was determined to break open. It was a debt of pure honor owed to the one person on earth who had understood what they were truly holding, and she meant to pay that debt in full, though the whole of the basin should burn to the wire around her in the paying of it, which was the whole reason that she let them come. She knew that Rourke had gone crawling to Vance because a man of Rourke's making could no more hide the shape of his own desperation than the crop could hide its crimson glow. And she knew that Vance had brought a professional in behind him because Alderman Voss had never once in its history sent anything less than a professional to recover what it believed was owed. She knew the harvest they all meant to steal from her, and she knew in a way that not one of them could possibly have imagined exactly and precisely what would happen to that harvest the moment it came up into their greedy hands. She stood at the head of the central trench in the last black hour before the eastern sky went gray, the crop humming all around her like a single sustained and holy chord, the crimson mist rising and curling off the leaves into the cold air. And she felt no fear at all anywhere in her, only the terrible and total calm of a woman who has already lost the one single thing on earth she was ever truly afraid to lose, and who therefore has nothing at all left over for any lesser man to take. Let them cut her fence, let them dig, let them fill their canvas sacks with the glowing roots and haul them out into the raw oxygen in the frozen dark. She had built the thing that would answer them. She had built it down into the very crop from the first dark seed she pressed into the ash, a fail-safe born not of malice, but of grief of a promise made over a dying man that this cure would reach the dying of the world, or it would reach no one at all, that it would never once again be locked away in a vault by men who valued a human body's slow and profitable decay above its healing. She turned the photograph once more in the white floodlight, the laughing face going bright and then dark as she tilted the plastic sleeve against the glare. Almost Marcus, her voice barely stirring the rising mist. A few more nights now, and it is out of my hands and into the world's exactly the way that we said it would be. They think that they are coming here to rob me. A sound worked its way up in her throat that was not quite a laugh, that had no trace of humor anywhere down inside it. They are coming here to be the last stress test, and the ground is ready and waiting for them now. She slid the worn photograph back into the inner pocket of her coat over her heart, where it had ridden every single night since the labs, and she drew the respirator up over her gaunt face. Somewhere down in Redfern that same night, the deacon was quietly oiling the hinges on a pair of new bolt cutters he had told his wife over supper were meant for the garden fence. Somewhere out on the Rourke Ranch, Vaughn Slate was laying out his breaching charges on a clean workbench with the unhurried calm of a man icing the corners of a cake. Somewhere down in Boise, Barrett Vance lay wide awake in the dark, counting over and over a recovery fee that would never once be paid to any living soul. The whole basin ground its slow way down toward the reckoning it had so carefully built for itself. Its hardware shelves stripped bare. Its decent neighbors turned to trespassers. A whole God-fearing community quietly talked clean out of its own soul by the running rumor of a cure for death lying just out of reach behind a wall. The drought at last began to break in the high country. The crimson mist rose and curled. The floodlights burned white behind the wall until the eastern sky paled once more to the color of cold ash, and Della Hargrove went down alone into the rows to make her final preparations, tending a miracle that had been grown out of pure grief in the poison of the dead man's ground, waiting with the bottomless and patient calm of the truly bereaved for the greedy men of the Cinnabar Basin to bring her at last with their own two hands the ending she had crossed an entire country to write. The wind that came down off the ridge that first week of November carried in it the bitter mineral chill of the season turning over for good, and it was 2 o'clock in the deep morning when the men who meant to rob Della Hargrove at last came for what she had grown. They came the way professionals come to a thing, which is to say quietly without the sirens and the mile-long dust plume and the bright noon bravado of the sheriff's failed raid 3 months gone. Vaughn Slate had parked the black rigs a full half-mile down the ridge and killed the engines dead there so that no idling vibration would reach whatever seismic sensors he simply assumed a woman that careful had buried somewhere along the approach road. His 3 contractors moved up on foot through the frozen sage with the spare economy of men who had done this exact work in far worse country than the high desert of Oregon. Behind the professionals came Emmett Rourke, with 20 of his ranch hands, the desperate and the loyal and the merely deep in debt to him, and they carried between them a small, clumsy armory of exactly the wrong tools for the work, mattocks and trenching spades and thick-rolled canvas sacks, the honest implements of men who fully believed that they were about to dig a fortune up out of the cold ground before the coming sun could catch them at it. Slate went first to the eastern run of the fence alone, and he worked a gray paste of thermal breaching compound onto the main steel support posts with the same unhurried care a man gives to frosting the corners of a cake. He stepped back a measured pace. He turned his face away from the posts. There came a low hiss and then a sudden flare of blinding white light that threw the whole expanse of frozen sage into hard black relief for the length of a single heartbeat, and 30 full feet of the high tensile wire that had held the whole basin's curiosity and greed at bay for the better part of a year sagged and ran and puddled down into glowing orange slag on the frozen dirt. The barrier that had made the Bristow tract look for so long like something the government kept men out of stood open at last, and the men poured in through the smoking gap it left. And the very moment they crossed that line, the smell of the place struck them all at once. That dense wall of hot copper cut through with a sweetness like sugar, scorched too long in a pan grown thick enough this deep into the cold season to coat the back of a man's throat and settle there and stay. The crops stood in a state that not one of them had been warned to expect. The purple leaves that had carpeted the whole field all summer long had drawn back and up now retracted like a slowly opening fist. And where they had lain there now stood the roots, themselves breached clear up out of the dark, rich loam, thick and knotted and glowing from somewhere deep within, with a slow, steady crimson pulse that beat like something possessed of a heart. The air above the rows shimmered and warped with the heat rising off them into the November cold. The whole 500 acres of the tract throbbed with a low kinetic hum that a man felt in the fillings of his teeth a full second before ever he heard it with his ears. And more than one of Rourke's hired hands stopped stone dead at the very edge of that pulsing field and had to be shoved bodily forward by the man crowding in behind because some deep animal part of them had understood. Well before their greed could shout the understanding down that they were walking on their own two legs straight into the open mouth of something. Start digging. Emmett Rourke's voice tore its way out of him in a feverish rasp as he dropped to both knees in the loam and clawed the first canvas sack open with his bare hands. Take the main roots, the big ones, the ones lit up brightest. Do not you crush the stalks. We do not get 1 red cent for pulp. Move damn the whole lot of you. We have got maybe 3 hours before that sky in the east goes gray on us. He was a man wholly possessed now, all 11 years of his patient waiting, and his whole ruined summer, in his humiliation on the porch, with the cold coffee pouring out of him at last into the frenzy of the dig. And the hired hands caught the frenzy off of him, the way men catch a running panic, spades biting deep into the earth, sacks filling and bulging, the whole field erupting into a churning chaos of flung dark dirt and grunting labor beneath the hard, flat, white glare of the work lamps Slate's men had set up on their tripods. Barrett Vance stood well back at the field's edge, where the flying dirt would not touch his polished shoes, and watched the excavation with a smile that felt at long last like the smile of a man collecting in full on a debt that the whole world had owed him for far too long. He had chased this since the day she turned him away at the gate with the gun in the crook of her arm, since the file that had cleaved his whole life in two on his desk in Boise, and now here it was, at last coming up out of the cold ground by the sackful glowing worth a recovery fee, with no ceiling anywhere upon it, and every single root that dropped into a filling canvas bag was another stone lifted clean off the old wound she had opened in his pride. He signaled Slate with a slight tilt of his head toward the dark and silent farmhouse at the field's edge. Secure the woman. Get the stabilization protocols out of her. The biochemistry that would keep the volatile harvest alive and stable across the long transit east, because Vance had read enough of that thick file to know that a crop this strange did not simply load onto a truck and travel, that there was a hidden science to the keeping of it, and that the one and only living person who held that science was standing somewhere back there behind that black window glass, watching them rob her blind. Slate took 2 of his professionals to the house, and they went in hard and fast, the front door coming clean off its rusted hinges under a single driving boot, their weapons up and sweeping, clearing the rooms of the dead man's ruined farmhouse with the practiced violence of their trade. They found nothing. Not nothing in the sense of an empty house, but nothing in the far stranger sense of a house deliberately stripped, scoured, and abandoned on a schedule. The floorboards throughout had been pried up and stacked neatly to one side, exposing the bare joists and the shallow crawl space beneath where heavy equipment had very plainly sat. Until quite recently, the deep rectangular impressions of server racks and instrument cases still pressed clean into the undisturbed dust. Whatever it was that Della Hargrove had run out of that house, she had run it out already carefully and entirely on her own chosen schedule. And all that now remained in the gutted front room was a single reinforced steel control box bolted down hard to the foundation itself, its face gone dark save for one small green light that blinked patient and slow and perfectly even, like a pulse, like a countdown, like a thing that had been left there, waiting for precisely this. Vaughn Slate stood over the blinking box a long moment, and for the very first time in a long career, built entirely upon being the man who surprised other men. A cold thread of pure doubt walked its way slowly up the back of his neck. Out in the field, the doubt arrived a great deal faster, and it arrived as sudden screaming pain. Wyatt Poole digging hard beside Rourke, because a 16-year-old boy goes always to where the money and the danger both burn. Brightest swung his heavy pickaxe down into the loam beside a root, as thick around as his own young thigh, and the iron point of it bit the taproot clean through, and the field answered the boy. A geyser of crimson sap erupted straight up out of the severed root under a pressure that no plant grown on this earth should ever have carried boiling hot, and it caught Wyatt full across both of his forearms and the heavy leather work gloves he wore. It's burning me, get it off, the boy shrieked, going over backward into the churned dirt, tearing frantically at the gloves as the sap ate down into the leather. And the sharp stink of scorched hide rose up over the copper as the stuff began to work its way through the glove toward the skin of his hands, beneath hissing like water flung across a hot skillet. The men nearest to the boy froze where they knelt. The men farther off, drunk, still on the frenzy of the dig, did not so much as look up, and their spades kept right on biting into the earth, and the field kept right on bleeding from 100 fresh wounds, and the low, steady hum beneath all their feet began so gradually that no single man among them could ever afterward have marked the exact moment that it started to climb. Rourke did not so much as spare one glance for the screaming boy at his side. He had gotten both his hands wrapped around the thick base of a root larger than any yet lifted from the whole field, a great pulsing, knotted, glowing length of the stuff that came up out of the earth, heavy as a fence post, and vibrated hard against his palms with a fierce, erratic, quickening rhythm, and he heaved it free of the clinging loam with a cry of pure and total triumph, and raised it up over his head into the flat white glare of the work lamps. "I've got it!" His voice cracking clean apart with a joy that ran very near to weeping. "I have got the mother root. I have got the whole." And every single floodlight ringing the entire perimeter of the 500 acres snapped on at once. The night became a merciless, blinding, artificial noon. The whole of the track stood suddenly revealed in a flat white glare that threw every man's shadow long and stark and black across the churned field that caught and lit the crimson glow of the exposed roots, in the darker crimson of the blood-bright sap, weeping now from a full 100 severed stems and from an elevated blind built cunningly into the ridge above the old silverworks, a fortified box of steel and glass with a clear commanding view. Down over the entire field, a structure not one of them had ever known was there. A voice came rolling down over a public address system, pitched loud enough to fill the whole of the sleeping basin. "You should have listened to the botanist, Mr. Rourke." Della Hargrove's voice rolled out across the field without a single tremor anywhere in it, without heat and without fear, carrying only the flat, clinical calm of a scientist, noting down the behavior of animals in a maze that she herself had designed and built. "He stood right down there in that dirt back in August, and he told you plainly what the crop does. He told you it pulls the poison up out of the ground and turns it into something the world has never once had. What he did not understand, because he had no possible way to understand it, was the second half of that same reaction. And what every last one of you is about to understand right now is exactly why I have grown this thing behind a wall in the dark alone, and exactly why I have never once for a single moment been afraid of the men who came here to take it from me." Rourke stood frozen there with the great root still raised over his head, and he felt the change in it before ever his mind understood the change. The vibration deep in the thing had shifted. The steady crimson pulse that had beaten in it like a living heart was faltering, now quickening, going ragged and wild, and the color of it was shifting fast under his straining hands, sliding from that deep arterial red toward a sick and unstable yellow. And the warmth that had been almost pleasant, almost alive against his palms, was climbing hard and fast now toward a heat that seared the flesh. He tried to shift his grip on it. The root would not let him go. "The plant is a closed-loop biological reactor." Della's voice came rolling down over the rising hum, unhurried, and even each separate word landing with the full settled weight of a thing decided upon long years ago. "For as long as the root stays down in the contaminated soil, the alkaline poison that every one of you spent a whole summer sneering at acts upon it as a chemical damper. It holds the reaction stable. It keeps the enzyme locked safe in the single form that heals a dying body." A pause, and when the voice returned to them, there was something in it now harder than the steel wire they had melted to get inside. The very instant that you sever the taproot and let the raw oxygen of the open air reach its core, without a cryogenic nitrogen bath to arrest the process, in the same breath, the rare earth enzyme does not simply spoil in your sacs. It oxidizes, catastrophically. Everything that every one of you has torn up out of my ground in the last 20 minutes is not a fortune anymore, gentlemen. It is a chemical fire, and it is looking for somewhere to burn. Emmett Rourke watched the miracle die in his own two raised hands, and the dying of it was violent past anything he could have braced for. The root blistered from the inside out, its glowing skin bubbling up into welts that swelled and split, and wept a boiling corrosive sludge gone from crimson over to a vile hot amber, and the heat of it roared up past anything a living man's hands could bear to hold. He screamed and he tried to fling the thing away from him, and he found that the melting sap had already fused the ruined leather of his gloves to the decaying, dissolving mass, so that for one long, unspeakable moment, he could not let go of the very thing that was eating him alive. And when at last he tore his hands free, the acid had already gone straight through the canvas of his jacket sleeves and found the bare skin of his forearms beneath, searing down through the meat of both arms with a swiftness that took the nerves before ever it fully delivered the pain. He fell to both knees in the churned loam, clutching arms that would never again in this life hold a thing the way they once had, the sharp stench of his own burning flesh rising up into the copper-thick air, and all around him, in the pitiless, flat, floodlit dark, the very same reckoning was already coming for every last man who had filled a sack. The stolen roots were all of them turning at once. All across the wide field, the harvest that had glowed so richly in the lamplight was going amber and vile in the canvas sacks, blistering and rupturing and dissolving down into that same boiling corrosive sludge. And the sludge ate through the bags and through the gloves and through the very spade handles and through everything it so much as touched. And the men who had carried the sacks dropped them and reeled back screaming, and found the sludge had already spattered their hands, their forearms, the fronts of their heavy coats, and the whole field filled up at once with the shrieks of 20 grown men, discovering all together in a single instant that the fortune they had come out into the frozen dark to steal had become an acid raining down out of the very stems they had cut. They trampled one another in the churned and steaming loam, scrambling for the melted gap in the fence, dropping the sacks that hissed and smoked where they fell. And the fine crimson mist, weeping now from 100 ruined stalks, drifted down over the whole scene of the panic like a poisoned dew, and the low kinetic hum of the field had climbed and climbed until it was a deep, resonant drone that shook the very ground. The whole 500 acres releasing all at once the stored energy of a full summer's slow transmutation as the severed roots gave up their impossible chemistry to the raw November air. Barrett Vance stood rooted where he was at the field's edge and watched a fortune with no ceiling anywhere upon it dissolve into smoking, worthless slag. In the space of 90 seconds, watch the recovery fee and the long-awaited vindication and the whole carefully rebuilt architecture of his own self-regard boil away together into the reeking dark, and something down inside the man came permanently unmoored in that moment that would never fully seat itself again. Vaughn Slate came out of the gutted farmhouse at a hard walk that broke into a run the instant he saw the field took in the melting harvest and the screaming men and the amber fire spreading sack to sack in a single, unhurried, professional glance, and did the one thing his whole trade had left him fit to do. He seized Barrett Vance by the collar of his fine coat and hauled the frozen, staring broker bodily back toward the melted gap in the fence, dragging him stumbling through the churn as the air of the whole valley thickened around them with corrosive smoke, because Vaughn Slate had done this precise work on 4 separate continents, and he knew the way a farmer knows a change in the weather, the exact moment when a job had stopped being a robbery and had become an evacuation. Up in the blind on the ridge, Della Hargrove logged the final readings into her encrypted tablet with a steadiness in her ruined, bandaged hands that would have chilled the blood of any man who had seen it. She was not watching a disaster unfold below her. She was watching a confirmation. The fail-safe had been the one last true unknown in 11 long years of the work, the single variable she could never once have tested inside a laboratory, because the testing of it required exactly and precisely this: a field breached and butchered by men greedy enough to try it, and now she had her data at last clean and complete, written across the dying field below in amber fire. The crop had done exactly what grief and long patient chemistry had together built it to do. It had made itself impossible to steal. A cure grown up out of the death of the one man on earth who had understood it would never once again be hauled off into the dark by men who valued it only for what its slow burial could be sold to protect. Because the very moment it left honorable and grieving hands, it ceased entirely to be a cure at all and became instead a fire that consumed the thief who dared to lift it. That had been the whole of the design from the first dark seed she pressed down into the ash-lined trench in April. It was never a lock upon a door. It was a choice welded down into the very biology of the living thing itself. It healed the whole suffering world, or else it destroyed the ones who reached out to cage it. And there was no third road anywhere between the two. The men who could still run were gone by the time the drone smoke finally began to thin, streaming back up over the ridge to the black rigs, half carrying their burned and their fallen between them, leaving behind them in the field a graveyard of dissolving sacks and the churned ruin of the miracle they had come to loot. Emmett Rourke was among the very last of them, out half-carried between two of his own loyal hands, his ruined forearms wrapped in a shirt that someone had torn off his own back to smother the burning. His triumph of an hour before curdled entirely now into a ruin that would follow the man into every single remaining day of his life. He did not look back once at the lit blind on the ridge. He could not make himself do it. To look back would have been to see the woman he had dismissed with a wave of his fork on his porch. Back in the spring, standing now in silent judgment over the smoking wreck of everything he had ever reached his hand toward, and even ruined. Even broken past mending, Emmett Rourke's pride could not bear to stand in that particular light. By the time the sky over the whole Cinnabar Basin at last went gray with the coming dawn, the Bristow tract was a smoldering black waste from one melted fence line clear to the other. The corrosive fire had run root to root and sack to sack across the whole field until the entire 500 acres that had drunk down a summer's record drought and thrived upon a poison meant to kill. It had reduced itself finally to a single vast crater of inert, faintly smoking ash. The purple all gone, the crimson all gone, the deep pulsing glow gone entirely out of the earth. The whole miracle burned clean up out of the ground as though it had never once risen from it. A man standing at the melted gap in the fence at first light that morning would have seen nothing left anywhere worth the crawl through the frozen sage to steal nothing at all, worth the bolt cutter stripped from the shelves of 3 counties. Nothing but a black and steaming field lying quiet in the cold gray dawn, where the single richest secret in the whole country had briefly impossibly been and now was not. The basin had gotten its treasure at last in the end, and its treasure was ashes. But Della Hargrove had not lost her harvest. That was the last true turn of the whole thing, the deep move that lay hidden beneath all the other moves, the one that not a single one of them, not Rourke with his 20 hired hands, nor Vance with his thick file, nor Slate with all his charges and his silent, high-flying drones, had ever once imagined a quiet, grieving woman could be capable of. The raid had not interrupted the harvest at all. The raid had been staged carefully afterward. 3 full nights before ever the fence came down, while the whole feverish basin lay awake in its beds, dreaming of storming her wall. Della had brought the true crop in, and she had brought it in not with mattocks and canvas sacks and the screaming of desperate men, but surgically, silently alone, using a fleet of autonomous subsurface drones that she ran from the buried steel control box beneath the farmhouse floor. The machines had gone down through the loam in the dark and lifted the mature taproots up whole and unbroken, and the very instant each root broke the surface of the soil, it had passed directly into a cryogenic bath, arrested and locked at the exact peak of its impossible chemistry, sealed away safe in stasis chambers of liquid nitrogen that held the healing enzyme fixed forever in the one form that saved human lives rather than the form that ended them. The chambers had ridden out of the sleeping basin in the dead of that same night on a secured freight car, and by the very hour that Emmett Rourke raised his one doom root up into the floodlights, the entire viable harvest of the Bristow tract was already 300 miles to the east, and still running hard, bound away toward hands that would give it out freely to the dying of the country at no charge at all. Exactly as a promise made in a windowless room over a dying man had long ago required that it must. What the looters had torn up out of the ground and stood watching dissolve into acid was only the remainder. The immature roots, the deliberate culls, the very last of the field she had let stand precisely, and only because she had known with total certainty that they would come at last for it, a decoy harvest grown for no other purpose in the world but to be stolen to spring the trap, to hand her the final stress test that her data still needed, and to hand the greedy men of the basin the exact ruin their greed had earned them. She had let them believe, every one of them, that they were robbing her blind. She had let them fill their canvas sacks with fire. She had let the whole avaricious weight of the entire Cinnabar Basin throw itself bodily against her wall so that it would break itself there publicly and permanently and past all recovering and leave the true miracle already long gone and utterly untraceable. Running east through the dark toward the sick people, it had been grown across 11 patient years to save. Elias Farrow read about the fire in the county paper 3 days after, and he understood a great deal more of the true shape of it than any other living soul left in the basin. And he sat a long still while with the folded paper resting in his lap. The mild man that the reagent strip had unmade out in that field, sitting now alone with the terrible weight of what he had come to know. He had held a living piece of that root cupped in his own hand. He had felt it pulse with warmth against his palm. He had knelt in the dirt and said the word cure aloud into a poisoned field full of armed men, and he had lain awake every single night since wondering whether he ought ever to have said it, whether the saying of it had been the very thing that loosed the running madness that in the end burned the miracle to gray ash. He would carry that particular wondering with him clear to the end of his own days, the memory of the impossible metallic gold blooming across the treated paper of the strip, the private certainty that he had stood for one single hour of his ordinary life in the near presence of something the world would not see the like of again for a full generation, and that he had helped with his own weak will and his own loose and shaking tongue to write the ending of it. It was the closest that mild man ever came in his life to genuine grief for a mere plant, and it was a good deal closer than he ever once admitted to any of the many people who asked him in the years after about the strange autumn the Bristow tract had burned. The reckoning fell upon the men who had earned it with the slow, certain grinding inevitability of a debt at last come fully due. Emmett Rourke sat out the long gray dawn in the emergency room of the county hospital, with both his forearms wrapped past the elbow in heavy dressings that would come off in the weeks still ahead, to reveal hands that would never again in this life do the hard work that had built the whole empire of his name, the nerves of them seared past the reach of any surgeon anywhere in the state. He faced a federal indictment for the armed breach of a sanctioned research site for trespass and for the willful destruction of protected federal property charges that Della Hargrove had made certain in advance would stick fast to him by the simple and merciless expedient of documenting every single second of the raid from the lit blind on the ridge and turning the whole recording over to the federal marshals before the ash out in the field had even finished cooling. His 10,000 acres would go in the end to the lawyers who defended him and lost. His grandfather's long-stolen water would run at last back to the county and the neighbors it had been taken from. The proud man who had given Della 3 months on his way to a plate of eggs at Ruth Ann's counter would spend the whole of the years he had left explaining to a federal court and to anyone else who would still sit and listen to him exactly why he had melted a woman's fence in the frozen dark to rob her of a cure for death itself. And no answer he ever gave to the question would make the plain arithmetic of it come out to anything but damning. Barrett Vance drove back toward Boise the morning after the fire, and this time he did not so much as slow at the county line the way he had the day she first turned him from her gate. His whole reputation went up with the recovery fee into the black smoke hanging over the Bristow tract because a man who has made his entire living trafficking quietly in other men's whispers cannot possibly survive, becoming himself the fool at the dead center of the single loudest whisper in the state, and the careful men he had called upon back in August, the ones who trafficked in the recovery of misplaced property, did not trouble themselves to return his calls come November. He had chased a fortune with no ceiling upon it, clear across a whole country, and it had turned to boiling acid in other men's hands and taken his good name down along with it. and he ended as men of Barrett Vance's particular making. So very often end not in a prison cell, but in a slow and dwindling irrelevance. A diminished man behind the wheel of a silver car he could no longer afford to keep polished, telling a story in emptying bar rooms that fewer and fewer people each passing year could be made to believe a story about a purple field and a silent woman who had offered him precisely nothing and had cost him in the end absolutely everything. Vaughn Slate simply vanished the clean and total way that men of his exact trade always vanish in the end, back into the wide gray daylight that lies between the things the law forbids and the far smaller set of things the law can ever actually prove. And if Alderman Voss ever came to learn that its stolen property had burned to ash in an Oregon field rather than been quietly recovered and returned, then the firm registered so carefully in Delaware never once said so aloud in any room that happened to have a window in its wall. The cure that they had murdered a good man to bury had escaped them a second time, and this time it had escaped not into some vault they might one distant day find a way to crack open, but out into the wide-open country itself, into free clinics and charity wards 300 miles to the east, and then farther still, given away unpatented and unpatentable, wholly unownable by any man, spreading out through the dying of a whole nation faster than any team of corporate lawyers alive could ever hope to chase it down, the one single form of the thing that no corporation on earth could ever again put back down into the dark. That was the true and final shape of Della Hargrove's revenge, and it was a shape that not one of the men who had come to rob her had been able, even at the very last, to so much as imagine, because it had not been built out of greed, and greed was the only blueprint that any one of them had ever in his life learned to read. She was gone before the marshals ever came, gone before the county paper printed a word of it, gone entirely into the very same gray dawn that had swallowed up the last of the smoke from her burning field. The dead man's farmhouse stood empty and gutted at the ragged edge of the smoking crater, the steel control box gone dark. Now its long work finished, its single patient green light gone out at last. Where she went from there, the basin never once learned. There were stories told afterward, the way there are always stories told afterward, of a gaunt woman in a heavy canvas coat seen boarding an eastbound freight in a town 2 counties over, of a slight figure standing alone in the open vestibule of a rolling freight car, with one bandaged hand laid flat against the frost-cold steel of a stasis chamber, watching the whole of the country she had crossed to make her promise. Good unspooled backward into the dark behind the running train. Whether any single word of it was ever true, no one who told the story could rightly say. On the eastbound freight 300 miles and more, from the smoking crater she had left behind her in the dead ground, Della Hargrove stood alone in the cold vestibule, with her ruined hand laid flat against the frosted steel of the nearest stasis chamber, feeling through the metal the faint, deep cold of the thing she had crossed an entire country to protect and to free. She took the worn photograph out from the inner pocket of her coat one final time, and she held it up before her in the gray dawn light, coming slantwise through the vestibule glass, the laughing face bright against the passing dark, and she did not speak because there was no longer anything left anywhere in the world that needed the saying. The promise was kept. The cure was up out of her hands at last, and into the world's exactly the way that the two of them had said that it would be, standing side by side in a clean room behind Delaware glass. Back before the soft-spoken men in the good suits sat down and did their arithmetic, and decided together that a healing was worth a great deal less to them than a slow and profitable dying. She slid the photograph gently back into its place over her heart. She turned her gaunt face to the east toward the country, coming up dark out of the last of the night to meet the running train, and she watched the frost upon the cold steel chambers catch and hold the first hard light of the rising morning, and the freight ran on and on beneath her boots, carrying the miracle away from the crater and out toward the sick and the dying, who did not yet know that a quiet woman in a canvas coat had crossed the better part of a continent and buried a whole life to do it, to keep one dead man's cure from ever again being buried in the dark.